It's a great pleasure to work again with our friends at IFNEC, with whom we work very closely, to hold another, what I think will be a very informative web event. The NEA, as many of you all certainly know, is an internet governmental organization with 34 now. Bulgaria recently joined us, member countries, and many of our countries are very interested in the possible future construction of new nuclear power plants, both in the near and the long term. Among the subjects that have been of great interest have been how to finance those plants, and that is the subject of today's conversation. So this is a subject that we, the people who are involved in the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, have spent a great deal of time talking about, and we work together to hold this webinar. Now, this was originally supposed to be an event that would have been held last year in Warsaw. Unfortunately, but due to the COVID crisis, we have been forced to postpone it multiple times. And instead of a single event, we have decided to move forward with the event in terms of a series of webinars, the first of which is today. So we're very pleased that the government of Poland, the Ministry of Climate and Environment, continues this cooperation with us to proceed to hold this very important series of workshops. And we will use this workshop opportunity to review the current state of nuclear financing and discuss key financing issues and challenges in countries interested in nuclear energy, both at the conceptual level and concrete proposals under discussion in many of NEA countries. As I said, this is only the first webinar. There will be 3 others to follow during the first half of this year. And each of these will focus on specific issues related to international cooperation in the area of nuclear finance, such as nuclear financing in embarking countries, exploring the role of multinational banks, export credit agencies, and other international financial institutions. Now, to begin this first workshop, I'm very pleased to be joined today by a representative of the Ministry of Climate and Environment, the Undersecretary of State, Mr. Adam Gibore Chedworski. I'm sure I'm totally mispronounced your name, so you may want to repeat it yourself. He is a graduate of HEC Paris in the history faculties of Paris-Sorbonne University and also University of Warsaw. His career at the ministry began in 2013 when he was part of the climate negotiator team for COP19. And between 2015 and 2018, he headed the Environment Department of the Permanent Representation of the Republic of Poland to the European Union in Brussels, where he negotiated draft legislation on the environment and climate in council working groups. In 2019, he once again became head of the Environmental Department of the Permanent Representation of the Republic of Poland to the EU. So we're very pleased to have the Undersecretary with us today. And sir, the floor is yours for your opening comments.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting us to speak and organizing together with IFNEC the discussion today. I think indeed it is one of the crucial elements, at least from a government's perspective, when we are planning the future development of our energy policy and looking at the different options available. Obviously, the impact on the cost of energy, on the competitiveness of our economy are one of the crucial elements that we analyze, and therefore the ability to finance these projects, these constructions with the cheapest possible solutions is of critical importance for the success of these strategies. We've seen in the recent years and a number of analysis that were conducted by different organizations, including the IEA, but also we've seen that in reports from the IPCC. We've seen that in the communication, the long-term strategy proposed by the European Commission for the EU Clean Planet for All. And in all of these documents, we always see a key role for nuclear energy to drive us on the road to climate neutrality. And in the analysis that we have done back home in Poland, looking at the different options that we have to transform our energy mix, to go down this route of climate neutrality, and to significantly reduce our emissions in the energy sector, we also came to the same conclusion that there is a crucial role for providing the baseload in the system for nuclear energy. But the necessary development of nuclear power encounters many challenges and problems today, and one of the most important is the availability of adequate and effective financing at a reasonable cost. It is indeed one of the greatest challenges that we face in bringing a new nuclear power plant from the development stage to a reliable, safe, and economic commercial operation. And without finding the right way to address this issue, there will be no successful nuclear power plants projects. And without nuclear, the transition to zero emission clean energy system will be much more difficult, we believe. So I'm happy to see that the agenda of the workshop today will address these issues and focus on three, in my opinion, key factors relating to financing. And they are, just let me recall them, that the first, the need to deal with the risks during the development of the construction of the nuclear power plant. Secondly, also the need to, the question how to overcome market failures and to enable a reliable and competitive power supply of electricity from nuclear power plants in future energy markets. And finally, how to successfully deliver these projects in time, but also at the quality level we expect, on scale, on budget, and at a reasonable cost. I'm happy to see that that one of the panels today will also focus on the role of governments, which is, in my opinion, they must take a very significant part in these new nuclear new build programs. So maybe let me go back and say a few words about the program we've been working on in Poland. Over the last year, we've been working on our national nuclear power program, and it has been approved by the government in October last year. The assumption in this program is that we will be building up from 6 to 9 gigawatt of nuclear power until 2043, starting with the first unit by 2033, and then following in the following decade, every other year, the commissioning of the next units. And if we look at the different plans in Europe, this seems to be the biggest nuclear new build program that we see in Europe. We are also working on at the same time last year. We were also working on our energy policy and the wider document looking at the different components of our energy mix. And in the frame of these works, we analyzed the different options and looking at how in the most cost effective way we could reach our commitments under the Paris Agreement, also delivering affordable energy to our society and our economy. And the most cost effective pathway was this one, including a significant share of nuclear alongside a significant increase in renewables. And we are currently also finalizing the process in terms of environmental impact assessment for the different pre-selected sites for the first Polish nuclear power plants. And we are also remodeling the ownership structure of the project companies designated to build this power plant. In terms of financing, we expect that going for a program of 6 to 9 gigawatts will allow us to benefit from economies of scale by building consecutive units using the same technologies and with the same partner in order to optimize, will allow us to optimize costs, the cost of these investments. And this is also looking at the cost and at the need to timely deliver also these projects that we are considering proven technologies that have experience across the world, and we expect the technology vendor, all the members of the consortium to also become co-investors in this project. And we see that project really as a very long-term partnership for our country and the vendors, also the vendors country. So we are currently working on that financing, as I said, and on the business model of the nuclear power plant, and we have there to take into account at the same time the interests of the electricity consumers, and not assessing the new power capacity project as purely investments, financial investments. And when we must meet with these projects also a number of requirements, including compliance with EU law and strategic document in particular related to the development of the electricity market towards 2050. We very much welcome, therefore, the work of the Nuclear Energy Agency in the field of nuclear power economics and financing, and the excellent workshops like the one we're having today on the topic that allow us to dive deeper in this subject. As I already mentioned, the financing of nuclear renewables remains a challenge due to high demand for capital and sensitivity also to conditions related to these funds, and this element will have a critical role in the success, the future success of our program. And I'm convinced that the constructive dialogue that we are having today will be very informative for us and can help guide also our future decisions. Finally, let me maybe close my opening statement by inviting you to a conference we have decided to organize in the autumn this year, hopefully in live format, if only the situation with the pandemic will allow us to convene that conference in a traditional way. So once again, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and to wish to all of you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your remarks, and also appreciate Poland's patience and willingness to host a live event, we hope, certainly in the fall. So we certainly look forward to that. And again, thank you for your comments. Next, I will invite we're very, very pleased to have the chair of the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation join us today in person, well, virtually in person, to give some thoughts. And this is an area, as I mentioned, IFNEC has been very active in since its creation. It has been truly giving a lot of leadership in the area of financing. So we're very pleased to be working with IFNEC to hold today's webinar. So with that, I give the floor to the chair of IFNEC, Alicia Duncan.
Thank you so much, Director General Magwood, and thank you to you and your staff of internationally recognized experts in the Nuclear Development Committee for your support, research, and published work in the area of financing nuclear builds. I also want to thank the government of Poland, specifically the Ministry of Climate and Environment, for their leadership in hosting this virtual workshop, which allows us to come together over the 2 days to have discussions on the very important topic of financing. I really appreciate the remarks of both the Director General and the Undersecretary, as they have highlighted the challenges we experience when navigating the challenge of financing nuclear new builds. I am very pleased to welcome all of the IFNEC leadership, member countries, and those interested citizens who have joined us from around the world today. As we continue to press forward in the midst of a global pandemic, I am pleased to have so many of you join us for this workshop. As the Director General mentioned, this is the first of a series of workshops designed to focus on the many elements of the complex topic of financing. Financing has long been a featured topic, a complex topic, and part of a living conversation that we have been having in IFNEC for many years. We have included it in conversations which have spanned the globe in our meetings on 5 continents, and yet still, along with some of the world's most recognized experts, find ourselves trying to solve these challenges that the Director General and the Undersecretary have outlined from their perspectives. One of the qualities that I respect most about the IFNEC framework and its membership is its diversity, which brings with it a variety of views, challenges, best practices, and opportunities for synergies. We have the curiosity, creativity, experience, expertise, lessons learned, even failures and successes to help us in our exploration of the focal areas which support our mission to provide a forum for cooperation among participating states to explore mutually beneficial approaches to ensure the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes proceeds in a manner that is efficient and meets the highest standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation. This diversity of thought will support our discussions over the next 2 days. I am so pleased at experts assembled to participate in these sessions, as well as the opportunity to hear from some of you about your thoughts and experience. Once again, I thank you, and on behalf of the IFNEC leadership, I'm very pleased to participate in today's discussions and look forward to our fruitful conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Duncan. It's again a pleasure to have you here. And our final speaker in the opening panel is the chair of the NEA Nuclear Development Committee, Patrick Letterman. I'm very pleased to have you here today as well. It really gives us a complete picture. And please, the floor is yours for your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Magwood. This workshop on the financing of a new nuclear project is at the center of the program of work this year on the Nuclear Development Committee of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. It is a follow-up of the report issued last year, Unlocking Reduction in the Construction Cost of Nuclear, covering both overnight construction cost and financing cost. And financing cost is really central for the reduction of nuclear cost, and efficient, effective policy to allocate construction risk and market risk between the stakeholders of a nuclear project, including governments, is essential to reduce the cost of capital and then the cost of electricity for the consumer. And clearly stated by the International Energy Agency, nuclear energy as a decarbonized and dispatchable energy is a necessary part of the energy mix for the future. To meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, below 2 degrees C, and also many countries are committed to zero net CO2 emission by 2050, 2060, and then efficient financing schemes have to be implemented. In addition, just to mention quickly a few additional priorities for the NDC, Nuclear Development Committee priorities for the program of work this year and next year, for technology and innovation on advanced construction cost and digital transformation, lesson learned, including from other industries and sharing best practices. Also, sector coupling with the role of nuclear energy to produce electricity and decarbonize hydrogen, advanced fuel cycle and waste minimization, and SMRs, small modular reactors, industrial and economic case. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So this concludes our opening panel, and I will close with just a few thoughts to pass on to you as you listen to these very good presentations and remarks you will hear over the course of this workshop. It's very important, I think, to recognize that we have learned a lot of important things over the last few years. And among the things that I have certainly seen is that whereas I think that many people think there's a debate about whether nuclear will play a role in the future energy transition, that debate is clearly over. Countries such as Poland, United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, certainly countries that have been building nuclear all along, such as China, Russia, many others. Countries around the world, including countries that have not built nuclear, and countries located in the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia, have made the decision that nuclear is really part of their future. I think the question today for many countries is nuclear accessible to them in the near term because of the issue of financing? And today, what we have seen through hard experience is that the electricity markets as they are configured today do not support the construction of a large energy capacity unless it receives some kind of subsidy. There are parts of the world today where you really cannot build large capacity unless there's a government subsidy or other incentive to build. That reflects to me that the markets are not functional. And this is something we really do have to address. Financing new nuclear projects when prices are so unstable is essentially not possible. Investments in long-lived, high capital intensity, low carbon technologies such as nuclear must be integrated with other objectives and have to be seen in a larger context. And that is something that I believe includes reduction of CO2 production in support of our environmental objectives. I thought, and I think the Undersecretary pointed to this, is risk allocation is a very important aspect of this. And the truth is, however you decide to look at the recent experience of building nuclear power plants, we have certainly seen that the private sector is not in the position to accept all the risks associated with building the first new generation of plants in many, many decades. The lack of experience in many countries, not all countries, but certainly many countries that would like to build plants in the future, reflect the fact that the lack of construction has created weak supply chains, a lack of experience in construction, a lack of regulatory experience, and this makes the risk profile so high that it's very daunting for many countries. The only way in the near term to address this is through government policy. We'll be talking about that in the course of this webinar. And finally, I think another hard experience that we have seen is that there must be an alignment of incentives among all the stakeholders involved in any nuclear construction project. In the past, there has been a philosophy that perhaps all the risk can be pushed to the vendors because the vendors have the financial incentive to have the projects go forward. We have seen that simply doesn't work. The vendors the owners, the operators, local stakeholders have to see the project as a whole and have to have an alignment as to make sure that their highest priority is the success of the project. If that is not the highest priority for everyone involved, then you are walking into problems. And that is partly including those who would provide financing. So we have learned a lot of lessons, and I think those lessons will be reflected in the conversations you will hear over the course of this webinar. So I wish you all the best as you listen to these very impressive presentations. I wish I could stay myself, but I've actually left one event to come to do the openings for this one. But I will look forward to reading the outcomes of this, and I will be talking with Patrick and Alicia and the IFNEC and NEA staffs about the outcomes of this to see what we might go forward with to address the issues that have been uncovered today. So with that, I hand the floor back to Michelle, who will take you forward into the rest of the webinar. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Undersecretary Giburgé-Czetwertyński. Thank you, Alicia Duncan, and thank you, Patrick Lederman. So now it's my role is to transition us to the fourth session of the workshop. You've all received the format, and we have organized the different sessions so that we can start with a conversation about financing of nuclear more at the conceptual level. In the first session, we'll be discussing the challenges of leveraging financing to meet our climate objective. Then we will be looking at more the specificities of financing nuclear power plant in today's electricity market. And then tomorrow, we'll have two other sessions at the same time in the afternoon, Paris time, where we'll be first looking at lessons learned, and that include both nuclear and non-nuclear infrastructure projects. And we will finish with a roundtable with policymakers to indeed explore the role of government and hear from first-hand experience of countries that are setting out plans for financing nuclear new builds today. Each session will last for 90 minutes, and we wanted to keep enough time for discussion, and so we'll be splitting the time with 60 minutes discussion, followed by 30 minutes of 60-minute presentation, followed by 30 minutes of discussion with question and answers. You can use the chat bar to ask questions. Some of you have already started to do so, and we are keeping a record of all the questions and make sure we can address them in the different sessions. Last but not least, I, with Jan Horst Kepler, will be moderating these four sessions today and tomorrow. And Jan will be leading the first session. So Jan, I hand the floor back to you to move us to the first session. It's 2:30 right on time.
Yes, thank you very much, Michelle, for this introduction. Welcome again to everybody. This was a very good introductory session, and we're now going to the first, moving on to the first topical session, session 1, which is called Delivering Investments in Low Carbon Technologies in line with long-term decarbonization objectives. The session will address some of the challenges that are being faced by capital-intensive low-carbon technologies, and in particular, new nuclear. This includes the ability for today's electricity markets to deliver the long-term price signal that is required to drive these investments, including through carbon pricing or capacity markets. The question is whether we can do with such augmented markets, or whether we need to pursue radically new approaches beyond the liberalized electricity markets that we have grown accustomed to in recent years. I'm very happy to be able to moderate this session with some of the foremost experts in this area. which will provide us with a broad but also deep and insightful, I'm certain, introduction into these important topics. The speakers are in this order: David Newbury, Emeritus Professor and Director of the Energy Policy Research Group, EPRG, at the University of Cambridge; Laszlo Varro, Chief Economist at the IEA; Cecilia Tam, he was team leader for the Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization of the OECD Environment Department; François Dassat, who is Head of Prospective and International Relations at EDF. And the panel will conclude with a presentation by Fabien Roch, Associate Professor at the University Paris-Dauphine and Executive Vice President at Compass Lexicon. Could you please put on your video and also your micro, the speakers who will intervene in this session? That's great. Thank you very much. We have sort of agreed that each presentation would roughly last 10 to 12 minutes. We have already received your slides, so we know they are very interesting. And I think I propose we will basically move on, go on through the slides, through the 5 presentations, and then, as Michelle said, open the floor for the questions. And Michelle will actually be looking at the questions coming in, we'll read them out, and we'll then pose them, put them to the speakers for their answers. With that, thank you very much. I would like to start off by giving the floor to David Newbury. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan Horst, and I should also thank EDF, who supported some of the research I'm going to report. The talk I'm going to frame by listing some of the challenges. We've heard some. I want to specifically draw attention to some of the more challenging parts. Then move on from that to say, what is it we need to do and why is it challenging? And the problem is that we need to increase the rate of investment very substantially, but we also need a low discount rate to make these low carbon technologies viable. Fortunately, on the supply side, the macro situation is such that we can now deliver that. But we still need to improve the market design, and I'm going to argue for the regulatory asset-based model. It's specifically useful in the context of nuclear power. And I shall conclude by arguing that it does make nuclear power competitive against the other alternatives. So in terms of the challenges, we've heard about the difficulty of predicting the future carbon price. It's a political construct. The ETS demonstrates that it's been a rather turbulent ride to reach the point at which we now have a market stability reserve doing some stability. But it's also worth pointing out that we're now at least on our 3rd market design since liberalization, and we're still evolving to deal with high penetrations of renewables and to decarbonize. The particular problem with nuclear power, as we've already heard, is that the construction period is both long and in the early stages with new designs uncertain. And it also faces political risk that countries have in the past suddenly decided they don't want to have nuclear power. And that risk is a political risk that is very difficult to deal with in commercial markets. And as a result, the private sector is very unwilling to finance such a lengthy and uncertain project. And it would require a low return, which means it would take a very long time to recover the money. And over that period of time, it's very difficult to predict what the environment, the political environment would be without credible guarantees. The obvious source of finance are the pension funds, which need a long-term assured return. But the way that pensions have been reformed to move away from defined contribution to move to defined contribution schemes which are flexible so people can move their assets around that means they're less willing to finance unregulated assets, which are illiquid. But on the other hand, they've demonstrated considerable enthusiasm for more liquid regulated assets. Now, if we look at the investment need, the critical point here is that we now accept that the climate damage, to assess the present cost of that and the present cost of carbon, it's only sensible to think of that at low discount rates. And the Stern Review in 2007 set out the standard welfare argument that the discount rate should depend to some extent on pure time preference, the risk of catastrophic ending of the world. 0.1% still gives a 1 in 100 year chance of destruction. But the critical element of the rate of growth of the world economy and the elasticity of marginal utility. And the growth rate, I think it would be optimistic to assume it's as high as 1.3%. There's considerable consensus that that's not a bad starting point. The elasticity of marginal utility, I think there's a very strong ethical rate argument for saying that should be 1. The effect of that is it weights lives of different standards of living equally, and that's a considerably morally imperative argument for it. And if you add that together, it gives a discount rate of 1.4%, which is extremely low. But clearly, if we're worried about climate damage, we should also be interested in mitigating damage, and that would argue strongly that projects which do reduce carbon should also be discounted at low discount rates. The supply side is fortunately very agreeable. I'll jump forward once to show that real interest rates have been on a steady downward trend for over 20 years now. And it's not just the recent events, nor even the recent financial crash. This is a long-term trend, which is primarily the result of demography. There's now arguably a savings glut with people needing to save for their retirement. And so the cost of public support is extremely low. The cost of public borrowing is very low. On top of that, at very low money rates of interest, monetary policy is extremely weak, and fiscal stimulus is becoming increasingly important. So public investment is now needed, and it's cheap. If we then look specifically at nuclear power, there's a very simple relationship. The cost of delivering the power is almost directly proportional to the weighted average cost of capital, the cost of finance. If you can halve the cost of finance, you can halve the cost of delivering the power. And this is a slide I showed at a recent EDF EPRI conference in Paris. So how do we do it? Well, the regulatory asset-based model is a tried and tested method for financing long-term infrastructure. The regulatory asset base is the base on which you pay the investors a return on their capital, and you also return the capital through depreciation. You increment it each year by the amount of new investment, and you decrease it by the amount of depreciation. But if we want to get a low weighted average cost of capital, then we have to reduce the risk and also make sure that the lenders are confident that they will be rewarded. And the advantages of placing risk on the developer are fairly small. The argument is usually to provide the incentive to have skin in the game, but the cost is extremely high, and the benefits of extra risk attached to the developer are relatively small. Now, we do have a very good example in the recent Tideway the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which was financed in the private sector, but with a regulatory guarantee on the return to the investors. And it was financed at a real cost of capital of 2.5%. And it was relatively straightforward to raise long-term funds to provide for the finance for a project which will last 100 years. In order to increase the confidence of investors, paying for the on the regulatory asset base during the lengthy construction period does increase the confidence. It reduces the risk and hence reduces the cost of capital. Politicians object to that because it's paying in advance of receiving the benefits, but it's a method that we've applied quite happily to other infrastructure, and so it's not unusual in that sense. And provide various incentives, keep costs under control, then one can provide various cost-sharing arrangements for cost overruns. So as I've said, it's widely used in Britain for the transmission system, for the waters, for the gas pipeline system. It spreads the risk over all consumers. The wider you spread the risk, the lower is the cost of finance. A model we've looked at for EDF would be a debt of 70%, with the company EDF or the construction consortium bearing 40% of any cost overrun, but capped at 130% of the agreed initial regulatory value. And if you were to pay over the course of the construction, it would amount to about £4 per year per customer, and as such would be negligible compared with the very substantial annual fees for electricity consumption. If it were built on time and budget and were financed at 3.5%, 1% higher than the Thames Tideway Tunnel, then the cost would be about £47 a megawatt hour. And arguably in a worst case scenario, it would still be less than £60. And that is less than the cost of certainly all fossil fuel with a proper carbon price and most renewable generation on a total system cost. So I would conclude that if we're going to decarbonize, we need to invest and we need to do so at low rates of interest. Fortunately, the supply side of capital is there and the cost of capital is low, and that we have a model which has been tried and tested for infrastructure and which will finance long-lived assets, the RAB model, and it works, I would argue, very well for projects like nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, possibly with bioenergy as well. Both of those are characteristic with high costs and lengthy lifetimes. And the incentive systems to reduce the cost of capital should be such that they don't place too much risk on the developer. And if all of that is done, then the infrastructure and pension funds should be willing and have demonstrated a willingness to finance similar projects. So with that, I will end, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, David. That was exactly the sort of introduction that we were looking for, that sets the scene and develops the key topics of our discussion in this first session. The next speaker will be Laszlo Barrow, Chief Economist at the International Energy Agency, also here in Paris. And I understand that Laszlo will not be using any slides, but will give us his remarks directly. And we look forward to listen to him. Laszlo, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this kind invitation and introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2020 was, of course, an historical, unprecedented shock to the global energy system. But just to illustrate the scale of the decarbonization challenge that we are going to face, on our trajectory towards a well below 2 degrees climate stabilization, on average, every 2 years, global carbon dioxide emissions will have to decline as much as they did in 2020. And next time, we will want to achieve that without shutting down the global economy. So even a historically unprecedented macroeconomic and social shock was associated with the world economy burning 7 billion tons of coal, 4,000 billion cubic meters of gas, and 90 million barrels of oil. And there is a general consensus that the most promising way to achieve a rapid transition is scaling up low carbon electricity generation. Electricity is today the largest carbon dioxide emission source, but decarbonized electricity could be the most powerful decarbonization channel for transport, heat, and other applications. But in this respect, we see good news and bad news. The good news is that wind and solar investment, which is the biggest and most rapidly developing low carbon investment, proved to be quite robust in 2020 and quite resilient to the coronavirus crisis. The bad news is that it remained robust and resilient at a wholly insufficient level. So if you run the numbers 2020, a bit more than 60 gigawatts of wind was built, a bit more than 100 gigawatts solar was built, and around 3 gigawatt new nuclear capacity started construction. When everything from this comes online, solar panels 6 weeks from now, offshore wind farms 2 or 3 years from now, nuclear power plants 5 years from now. This capacity will generate roughly 300 terawatt hours of electricity, which is around 1.2% of global electricity generation. And when you look at the historical data, 5 years ago when the Paris Agreement was signed, this number was exactly 1.2% as well. Solar investment significantly declined. Solar investment significantly increased, sorry. Nuclear investment significantly declined, but you don't need a gigawatt of solar capacity to replace a gigawatt of nuclear capacity. They operate with very, very different load factors. So the decline in new nuclear investment in the past 5 years is roughly equivalent to 2/3 of the increase in global solar investment. So 2/3 of the global investment in solar, which is the most successful renewable technology by far, is simply replacing one type of low carbon capacity with another type of low carbon capacity without contributing to decarbonization. And given that global electricity demand is growing under normal macroeconomic conditions, at roughly 2% per year, this level of low carbon investment is sufficient only to slow down the growth of global carbon dioxide emissions and global fossil fuel use. So any credible decarbonization pathway will have to be associated with a roughly 3 times expansion of the average annual new low carbon capacity put into the system. Now, if you ask the question, can we do it without nuclear? Is nuclear really necessary? Can we go for 100% renewables? And the answer is yes, it can be done. It doesn't violate the laws of physics. In fact, there are important countries like Germany and Italy who want to do precisely this. However, IE analysis very closely shows, and this is inconsistent with a number of system analysis studies conducted around the world, that while 100% renewable strategy is possible and it doesn't violate the laws of physics, it is a considerably more difficult strategy, and it is also associated with higher energy security risks. So in those countries where nuclear is accepted as an option and government support is used, for those countries, it's definitely a good idea to maintain nuclear as a long-term solution to the energy system. And I would very much second Director Magwood's introduction that the countries which envisage nuclear playing a role in their energy transition, they represent a majority of global fossil fuel use and the majority of global carbon dioxide emissions. However, we also have to face 2 very important facts here. One is that the new construction experience in both Europe and the United States over the past decade was an unmitigated disaster. It was not simply one bad project. No, there is no good project. Every single new nuclear plant project that was launched in Europe or the United States ended up with multi-billion euro cost overrun or multi-billion dollar cost overrun, a multi-year project delay, and in some cases, even a project cancellation after several $billion were spent. And this decade was also associated with wind and solar technology overperforming expectations. You can add to that also the fact that with the current technology, with the 3rd generation reactor design, nuclear power plants are very, very large. in the renewable space, the largest renewable projects, the large offshore wind farms, represent $2–3 billion capital investment, and they use a modular technology. So for a $2 billion offshore wind farm, that would be like 100 identical turbines of maybe 20 million each. Whereas for a third generation nuclear reactor, it's a $10 billion project. And when you start the project, you don't know how much it will cost. By the time you complete it, you don't know how long it will take to build it. So if I consider the financial position of the utility industry, the very painful experience with project management risks, and also the very attractive investment opportunities in the wind and solar space, I think realistically, we are not going to see new nuclear investment from any privately owned utility, either Europe or in the United States, ever again. So now we are seeing very promising nuclear buildup in China, in Russia, in a couple of other countries, where basically nuclear is rolled out from direct state investment. In China, in Russia, they have a cradle to grave nuclear industry, which has integrated technological approach, power plant design, fuel supply, project management, operations. They have a resolutely pro-nuclear political leadership, and they have big state-owned banks, which are prepared to go all the way to further the strategic objectives of the government. Now, this is an old school financing model. This is, by the way, exactly how the French nuclear power plants were built, or how the British nuclear power plants were built back in the 1970s. This is an old school model, but it actually works. It delivers the goods. So I think one lesson for me is that due to the nature of the nuclear technology, I don't think there is anything wrong with being nuclear, with nuclear being in state ownership. Maybe nuclear is a technology which we have to treat as a basic infrastructure, where government ownership is the default option. Now, it is possible, of course, to have private investment in basic infrastructure. There are toll highways, there are concession railways or concession airports, but in those cases, the investment process is essentially policy determined, and certain project management and operation issues are outsourced to the private sector. I fully agree with Professor Newberry that the current ultra-low interest rate environment is a major opportunity. But in order to take advantage of this major opportunity, you either have to have direct state ownership and just simply the government issuing bonds and building like the way governments build bridges or highways, or you would need to have contractual structures which allocate risks in a fashion that they will be essentially equivalent to government bonds and suck in private investment. Now, I think it's also very important not to have a discriminatory regulation. So, for example, when governments discuss hydrogen, as just like almost every government discusses today, I would recommend against governments mandating 100% renewable energy for hydrogen. Now, hydrogen certainly should be decarbonized, but I don't think governments should have a legal mandate to pick one particular technology for decarbonizing hydrogen. I think very similarly, when large companies have decarbonization ambitions, I think they should be open to different technological options. One example which I would endorse and I would very much support, Google recently published a low-carbon strategy where they are already major investors into wind and solar power. But if you read Google's low-carbon strategy, they explicitly leave open the option of various nuclear technologies. So I think not discriminating against nuclear in financial regulation, in low carbon targets, in other different obligations would be very, very important. Otherwise, we unnecessarily increase the financial risks. But I should emphasize that even without any technological discrimination, industry would have to do a much, much better job delivering projects on budget, on time. Because the core of the financing problem, in my view, is the project management risk. And even if governments are willing to sign very safe long-term contracts, it is up to the industry to deliver. For the current third generation nuclear technology, realistically, I think a very, very extensive government involvement would be needed. I would consider it to be legitimate. So for countries where the underlying geography and the social attitudes are such that nuclear is accepted by society and the geography mandates its use, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with governments going ahead and owning nuclear power plants or governments going ahead and signing PPP contracts. While at the same time, I think we also need to make sure that innovation to new nuclear technologies is accelerated. Because what I also find interesting is that while there is very, very little private sector appetite for the current technology, the current nuclear technology, there are several private sector investors who are interested in new nuclear technologies. There is a lively venture capital investment scene in new nuclear technologies. Now that's more of an innovation policy issue, and governments have a very important role in accelerating the rollout of those new nuclear technologies. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. I take three important points away from your talk. That we have to see nuclear alongside renewables in a larger context of decarbonization. The second that I take away is that nuclear in many ways is more akin to infrastructure rather than to a standard sort of power plant project. And finally, I find very interesting your third point. For me, the third important point is that financing is to a large extent a project management issue. And we will have an occasion to discuss that tomorrow afternoon, and so we'll come back to that. Thank you. We will now move on to Cecilia Tam, who is also part of the OECD family, the OECD Environment Directorate, who will talk to us on clean energy finance, which of course nuclear is part of or hopes to be part of. And she will also branch out a little bit into an issue that was already mentioned by David Newberry, the role of institutional investors such as pension funds in the financing of large low carbon infrastructure projects. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. And can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, okay.
Yes, okay, excellent. So I'd like to thank the NEA and the IFNEC for inviting the OECD to participate in this important discussion. Perhaps just a few words to help frame my intervention. I come from the OECD Environment Directorate, where we are one of the directorates that leads on the Center for Green Finance and Investment. The center provides research and analysis really to help support policy development. And we also hold the annual Forum on Green Finance and Investment to convene leading actors in the green finance community to help catalyze and support transition to a green, low carbon and climate resilient economy. The center leverages the OECD's policy and economics expertise and provides a platform for engagement with industry, the finance community, governments, regulatory institutions, academia, and civil society. I will be, as Jan mentioned, framing my remarks really more around the financing aspects and really looking at financing of low carbon infrastructure, the role of policy in helping to catalyze these investments, and particularly how we can really target the trillions that are held by institutional investors, and also highlight some of the recent developments in the policy regulation, the financial regulation side of things, as well as some initiatives among finance community and key actors there, and what this will impact for nuclear. Just very quickly to explain a little bit where I'm coming from. I lead the OECD's Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program. We work with emerging economies in Asia and Latin America to help strengthen clean energy policy frameworks, clean energy finance and investment frameworks to facilitate more private sector investments in renewable electricity and energy efficiency. But while the scope of my program is a little bit outside this, is not directed at nuclear, many of the issues that are coming out of our work are very common because it's around financing of low carbon infrastructure and low carbon energy infrastructure. So if we look at this transition that we're talking about, that's going to be necessary for the energy sector, this slide comes from the IEA's World Investment Outlook, and it really shows that a rapid transition will be required to shift investments away from fossil fuels towards low carbon energy. As Laszlo's highlighted, a lot of that will be from renewable electricity generation, but also important shares of nuclear as well as CCUS technologies. And we have seen very encouraging signs from countries, not just in OECD countries, but major emerging economies that are announcing coal phase outs or coal moratoriums, which signals very positive direction in terms of broader low carbon technologies, but also nuclear and CCUS. At the same time, we've also had very ambitious announcements from a variety of financial institutions in the public as well as the private market space that they will no longer be financing coal plants, setting a very strong direction that investors are looking for more low carbon investment opportunities. So, you know, with that optimism, why then are we seeing such challenges around raising sufficient finance for climate mitigation? Laszlo rightly mentioned that a lot of the investments that were going for low carbon energy that was perhaps going for nuclear is being shifted more to solar, but we're not getting that multiplication of increase in low carbon technologies. And, you know, here some of the challenges and discussions with financial players that we see, and I think we need to discuss, is to ensure that you do have compelling risk and returns that private investors will be looking for. Professor Newberry talked about and highlighted these issues around social discount rates and return requirements here. We continue to need to emphasize to financial market actors and regulators themselves, highlighting the need and setting regulation that will encourage a shift or focus away from short-term performance towards more long-term returns, and the need to, in the financial markets, increase disclosure around climate risks that should also shift the market towards longer-term investment and longer-term investment considerations that all bode very well for low-carbon electricity sources. When we're looking at some of the challenges we see for nuclear, I think Laszlo highlighted a lot of these very well. One thing that I would like to emphasize is this issue around the fact that when we're trying to capture institutional money, while we highlight there's lots of capital and there isn't a shortage of finance, there is a shortage, I would say, of investable, bankable projects. So this is really around setting the right types of investment vehicles and ensuring that the different projects, whether we're talking about renewables or nuclear, can really provide investors the visibility the performance and return requirements that they're looking for. And as Laszlo mentioned, nuclear continues to struggle to provide certainty to investors that they can perform and build plants on time and to budget. And this is something that renewable energy projects have actually done very well. And the message here is, I think, there's a lot of capital out there, but it is the different infrastructure projects need to compete for the same pot of funding. And for nuclear to really compete in that space, they need to be able to demonstrate these issues around risk return and performance. Some solutions around that are around ensuring that we have good data available to address some of these investor concerns around the ability to facilitate investments and address some of these performance risks that many investors, particularly on the nuclear side, are very much concerned about. I also wanted to highlight very quickly some of the developments on the financial market side of things in this discussion around financing nuclear and financing low carbon technologies, to highlight work that is going on at the OECD, but in many countries around developing sustainable finance definitions and taxonomies, and the role that this will play in driving capital towards low carbon infrastructure, and how that could potentially support not only this transition to low carbon electricity, but also for consideration in the nuclear finance sector. And the OECD recently released a comprehensive report highlighting the different pathways or taxonomies and definitions that major economies were taking, including the EU, China, Japan, France, and the Netherlands, and how this in the nuclear financing discussion will also become particularly relevant. This is particularly interesting because of the increasing trends towards the need for financial disclosure, as well as evaluation on risks of portfolios to climate, and the need to report and evaluate portfolios for long-term risks. And then finally, looking at some of the, let's say, solutions or ingredients to attract finance and investments, and the role that government policy plays in this. First and foremost, we need to have clear, credible, and predictable policies. We need consistency in those policies, and the previous speakers have already highlighted some of the political risks around that, which is particularly key for nuclear, but also for other low carbon technologies. Thirdly, for newer technologies, and here, while nuclear is not a new technology, many nuclear new build countries, this is a new technology for those markets. And as Professor Newberry and Laszlo has mentioned, the role that governments will play in this and finance for government is going to be critical across the space of low carbon technologies, but also in the case of nuclear, where we need to have more government intervention, and the governments will play a critical role in financing the nuclear projects. Then I think we should also be looking, and this is at innovations in different business models, as well as financing. To capture some of the institutional funds, we also need to ensure that we have the right types of investment vehicles that allow them to invest in a variety of projects, whether we're talking about green bonds, or is it just syndicated loans, whether it's taking equity stakes to look for higher returns, to address these longer term finance commitments. But there is a need across the low carbon electricity space to ensure that we have the right types of investment vehicles that match the scale and liquidity that these institutional investors will be looking for. And then finally, just to reiterate this point around the taxonomies, how we're seeing really improved conditions for green finance, and quite a lot of optimism in the market, given commitments around coal phase out, as well as announcements from financial institutions themselves wanting to and needing to align to Paris, regulation pushing them in that direction, as well as long-term government pension funds really leading this drive to spur capital or green investments or green finance into this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of the consistency of government policy in this area. We need to de-risk the projects in order to make them bankable. This notion of bankability will be one of the themes during these 2 days. And finally, also reminding us of the growing importance of these taxonomies. And of course, the NEA is looking at those, but it's an ongoing discussion. Thank you. We'll be moving on to François Dassa, who is the head of Perspective Studies and International Relations at EDF. And EDF is, of course, one of the, not only an operator of nuclear power plants, but also one of the companies to whom we look forward to for constructing new plants. And François, we're very interested in hearing how you want to realize new nuclear power projects and how to finance them. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for NEA, IFNEC, and the Polish government to organize this important workshop. I will give a view, as you have mentioned, Jan, of a practitioner. And of course, there are many peculiarities, many specificities of nuclear technologies. But I would like to highlight one key element that, according to us, in our experience, concrete life, is key to unlock the new construction, but also the fact of maintaining the existing capacities online, especially in a liberalized market and in Europe. I don't see the slides, but I don't know if you can pass them. And this key element to unlock to maintain of existing capacities and in the new construction is the fact that the need for long-term contracts. This is a key element, and from this standpoint, nuclear is not an exception. Actually, I will try to describe why we think that long-term contracts are actually needed for all technologies as far as investment are concerned. And this raises particular questions for the EU, more generally, more broadly for all liberalized market, but in the EU, I think there is clearly more stringent need to move faster into some kind of paradigm shift within the EU market design. So my presentation would be in two parts. First of all, examine what are on field, let's say, the challenges that we are seeing for all investments, including nuclear, in the EU market, and what could be the way forwards in the second part. There are here two possible routes, which is part of the debate. One is to say that we have to go, that the market could fix, more market could fix the market. but I will give some elements that make this route highly improbable, according to me, and that we will need, on the contrary, long-term contracts for all generating units moving forward, and the sooner the better. So if we look at the current situation of the electricity market and regarding investment in the next slide, as you know, the question of is market able to drive efficiently investment is has a long history between economists. But what we see on the ground, at least in the EU, but more globally, it is that in reality, most of the investments which are made, the immense majority of investments which are currently made in the electricity sector in Europe, and which have been made in the last decades, are almost currently all regulated. So on the field, the operators have chosen between market and regulation. They have chosen regulation. So I put it some figures about in Europe, 250 gigawatt of new capacities between 2005 and 2017. Most of them were driven not by market, they were regulated. The few thermal plants have been invested in receiving market prices, but this decision was made before 2008, so a long time ago. This is also something which is more general. As you can see on this chart, only 3%, according to the IEA, of current electricity investment are made, on the market. So a huge majority is not paid by the market, but by regulated and some kind of long-term remuneration. So in Europe, as you know, since the 90s, the idea was to put markets as the center. Markets are clearly delivering for short-term efficiency, but as far as investment are concerned, they are not at the center at all. And this makes me think of, Foucault's great book, Les mots et les choses, the words and the things. On the one hand, you have the words, the market, and regarding the things, you have investments which are not driven by the market. There is a growing divide. There has been a growing divide in the next decades between the words and things in the European electricity market. It is time to make the words and the things a little bit more aligned. This situation is driven by, we can see that in the next slide, structural elements. The fact that, remuneration by the market does not consent to recover, as it is evidenced in this chart, the complete costs of the generating units. Here, this is drawn from the World Energy Outlook 2018 of the IEA. In blue, you have the amount of money, the percentage of the complete cost of generating units in the EU, which can be recovered by the market. In yellow, you have the impact of rising CO2 price moving forward. And you have in gray, the share of the complete costs, which need to be recovered sometime. So here we see that already currently we have a situation where the market does not provide enough revenue to finance all the costs of the generating unit. It is worsening. And unfortunately, it doesn't look to be able to go better. And by 2030, almost there will be a lack of remuneration by the market of around 40%. This raises some concerns, not only for all new generating units, but also for maintaining the capacity of existing assets. At a time when 2/3 of the existing thermal plants in Europe have to be renewed, this raises clearly a real electricity security issue quite rapidly. So if I move to the second part of my presentation about the solutions. So let's examine the first route, that is to say, what could more market fix the market? Some are arguing that it is just because we don't have enough market that we are in this situation. If we want to go this route, some key conditions will have to be met. I've listed some of them, but all are problematic. So they raise implementation issues. For instance, we would need to remove the caps from that today exist on the wholesale market, to allow very high prices in times of with a high probability of loss of load, up to 20,000 euro per megawatt hour. During very tense hours. This is only with the criteria of 3 hours per year, which is currently the criteria which is used. Of course, as more renewable will be put into the system, the criteria itself will have to evolve due to the transformation of the loss of load profiles, and this value will have to increase. But in practice, the acceptability of such high prices is debatable, but more profoundly, the question of controlling the market power exercise will considerably limit the possibility of removing those caps and accepting such high prices. Second, that could, if we were to follow this route, would to generalize real-time pricing. Of course, this will imply more volatility, as we will have more volatile market prices moving forward. And this might contradict significantly with the fact that at the same time, we have to pursue some energy efficiency efforts. But energy efficiency is as capital intensive as many generation investments. So here it might contradict with the fact that, strongly with the fact that we have to deliver some clear signals about to trigger the right investments levels in energy efficiency at the consumer side. Third point, we would have to generalize nodal pricing due to the very significant network development involved by a higher share of variables. This poses real questions in terms of IT. For the time, this nodal pricing has been implemented up to now in some regions, but with a limited number of nodes, it is very difficult to think that we could enhance significantly, as it would be needed, the number of nodes from 1 or 2 or even 3 orders of magnitudes. More deeply and structurally, when we look at the experience of nodal pricing, at the end of the day, we see that where you have congestion, in reality, you have a very intrusive regulation. So in reality, nodal pricing in practice is a de facto regulation of congested nodes due to the monopoly power or the oligopoly power at some of the nodes of the system. So for all these reasons, it appears that ex-ante regulation could be more effective than the generalization of nodal pricing. I will go very quickly, about corporate PPA and capacity markets, which are another way maybe to follow the market route moving forward. But these are it is highly difficult to see them as a potential solution. Corporate PPA, because of a very difficult convergence of price expectations moving forward, due to the fact that with more renewables on board, the merit order effect, the more you put renewables, the less you have a price. So on the one hand, you have, so it is hardly difficult to think that long-term private consumers will engage into a long-term contract at the long-term marginal cost of renewables, while they will have higher chances to get a better deal by market prices. Regarding capacity market, they are not fundamentally, as they are today, driven a right tool for investment due to their very short-term time horizon for the time being. There are some willingness, especially in the UK, to extend the time of this, the time length, the time horizon of those capacity markets. At the end of the day, if you want them to be really useful, we go back to the long-term contracts that are part of the second route. More fundamentally, there is the next slide. I think that there is also some difficulty, if we move along the market route in order to meet EU's renewable targets. Renewable targets are decided and fixed politically. They have no reason to be optimal in terms of the economics, are not driven by market. As a matter of fact, there are too few studies, according to me, to analyze from a normative point of view the optimal pathway for Europe. Here I put some example of one of the studies, of the few studies that shows that the optimal level of renewables could be around 1/5 or 1/4 of the European mix. If you increase, even if you increase the price of carbon, then you have an even lower level in this study of wind and solar, due to the fact that you allow other technologies like CCS and so on to enter into play. So the fact that renewable targets will be much higher than what could be a share when we let the market play, makes it very difficult to follow this market route in order to meet those renewable targets. So the dilemma for Europe in this is then, if we let renewables investment be driven by the market, then the objectives cannot be reached. And if, on the contrary, if we want to reach the renewable objectives, then you will need continued support for the renewables. So all these elements tend to show that we will need, as evidence in the next slide, we will need short-term markets for short-term efficiency, but long-term contracts for all technologies moving forward as far in order to have the right level of investments in the different technologies that the different countries will choose. So there are many many examples already existing of such long-term mechanisms in Brazil with planning authorities, tenders, and long-term contracts for investments. The UK is also another example of moving in that direction with some indicative planning and CFDs for new zero carbon plants. I think here we see that we will need long-term contracts in order to get the right level of investments in the technologies which are needed moving forward, and to maintain existing capacities. This is nuclear is no exception. This requires a significant shift from the European Union in order to adapt the market to this situation, which is a structural situation. Actually, the market, the idea that the market could give a proper signal for investments in the long run in the electricity sector might have a sense in the 90s, where you had to deploy CCGTs, which are have a low capital intensity, moderate to short construction time and lifetime. So this has been the case for in the year 2000 in Europe with the dash for gas. Now the idea is to move to develop completely different technologies, zero carbon plants, and also energy efficiency, as I was mentioning, much more capital intensive, long lifespans. So we need to have to adapt the market design in Europe, especially to this new situation. Nuclear energy needs those long-term contracts. This is no exception. All technologies will need those long-term contracts moving forward, and this shift in the way, in the architecture of the system and the role of market for investment is absolutely needed, and sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, François. You made your point of a need for a paradigm shift very convincingly. I also completely agree with the point, and we've made it repeatedly, that the right market design really depends on the underlying technology portfolio, which of course is also a function of policy objectives. If you want low carbon technologies, you'll have certain characteristics which will demand certain forms of financing. That's a very important point. The key question, of course, is once we're all on board for long-term contracts, how can we allocate those in the most efficient manner? And there we hope some insights from Fabien Roch, Associate Professor, Dauphine University and Executive Vice President, Compass Lexicon. Fabien, I had a chance to look at your slides and I saw as you had, I think, 26 of those. We're already behind. Please try to really stick to the 10-12 minutes for the presentation, and then we will move towards the questions. Thank you. The floor is yours, Fabien.
Thank you, Jan. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to present.
Fabien, you might want to raise your micro a little bit. It's not very loud. We can't hear you that well.
Right. Sorry about that. Is it better if I speak a little bit closer?
Yes,
or...
definitely.
Good. So let me try and cut a long story short. I did not intend to present all of the slides, and the good thing about presenting last is that actually you can build on what the others have already presented. So I feel I will try to complement what has been said before on some specific points, and I will naturally skip a good number of my slides in passing so that we stick to 10 minutes. I have 3 main points, which have already been, I think, largely covered. The first one is the EU ambition for decarbonization, and more generally, the global ambition for decarbonization leads to a need for investment in clean technologies, as well as flexible technologies. What I mean by that, batteries and demand response, etc. If you think about it, what nuclear, renewables, batteries, EVs, and a lot of these have in common is that they are capital intensive technologies. So that's my first message. And obviously it means that we need to design a market design that recognizes the cost structure of the dominant technologies. An efficient market design needs to obviously fit the technology cost structure that is observed in the industry. My second point is I want to dwell a little bit more into the linkages between market design, risk allocation, and cost of financing. I think Cecilia already made it clear, but I want to provide some empirical data on this. And finally, as you asked, Jan, I will conclude with some of the work that is ongoing with the chair that we have in Dauphine on the evolution of market design. So I will skip my first few slides just to point to you a number of studies which have been published, to which we contributed. One with the NL Foundation on essentially the modeling of the EU decarbonization pathways, where we identify the capital cost required to make that happen. And the short story is, you see, more or less, a 50% increase in the capex required. My second snapshot is a study conducted for the French Nuclear Association. I'm currently also working for the European Nuclear Association, Foratom, on scenarios to 2050 of decarbonization in Europe. The short story of this study is that if you do not replace some of the nuclear plants in France, you just assume that you are going to get rid of all of them as they reach their end of lives. Well, essentially, you make it a lot harder to reach complete decarbonization. You need to substitute nuclear capacity with even more renewables and even more flexible technologies, batteries and seasonal storage. Now, the important point coming out of that study is as well the fact that the price dynamics in the market, and I think this will connect with the previous speaker's points, the price dynamics is completely modified in 2050, even with significant deployment of batteries. We see a load duration curve and a price duration curve that shows a lot more frequent occurrences of high prices. What that means is that there will be an investability problem because very volatile prices don't necessarily need to a lot of investment for the good reasons that were highlighted before. There is a certain risk aversion for investors if they cannot have a predictable stream of revenues. And there are a number of studies which have identified the impact on the WACC, on the weighted average cost of capital, associated with power price risk. I have done a literature review of these different studies. Obviously, the types of risk is different depending on the paper you look at, but broadly speaking, long-term contracts can reduce somewhere between 1% and 5% the cost of capital. This is for established clean technologies such as wind, solar, or nuclear. I'm going to give you a couple of very concrete case studies on this. The first one is there have been 4 or 5 studies done 6-7 years ago following the move away from ROCs, renewable certificates for renewables in the UK, towards contracts for different CFDs, where essentially you reduced the exposure to market risk via the CFD. And these studies concluded to a reduction of somewhere between 0.3 and 0.9% of the WACC. Again, this is not hedging the full price risk, it's only part of it. Another interesting case study is a move to infrastructure regulation. I want to connect that to David Newbury's presentation. The UK model moving to a RAB approach is essentially moving to infrastructure regulation. Again, you have a number of studies that have estimated the impact, and that impact is greater than 3% in all studies on the weighted average cost of capital. So feeding that obviously into a cost estimate of nuclear and other capital intensive technologies, you would see a very significant impact on the total costs. I will conclude in 1-2 minutes with the sharing of some of the thoughts that we are developing with you, Jan, and with other colleagues also at Dauphine University on the future evolution of power market design. I want to come back to that chart, which is, I think, a set of more granular data than what Francois presented before, but it's very similar. It's essentially an evolution of how investments have been made in power generation in Europe. We've looked at that country by country, almost plant by plant. And what we found is that, well, up to the 90s, it was essentially historical monopolies. There was a period, interestingly, in the 90s, in the UK and in some other European countries in the 2000s, where the dash for gas essentially led to merchant investment. You see the blue bar. But actually, the share of merchant investment in total investments has been consistently decreasing in the past 2 decades. So if you look at the 2010s, and if you look at our projection for the 2020s in Europe, the vast majority of power generation investments in Europe are either backed up by some form of long-term contracts or actually financed based on public agreements, publicly owned companies or infrastructure regulation. So where does that lead us in terms of market design? Well, our thinking is very much that we need to try and reconcile what I would call the competition in the market, which is what we have in Europe today, with competition for the market, which is what Francois referred to as long-term contracts. And this is something we see in many other industries, where essentially you have a set of tenders, auctions for long-term contracts to organize the competition for the market, potentially followed by competition in the market. And the simple division, if you want, of these two things is to think of the competition for the market as delivering on the policy objectives. So you deliver on the mix that policymakers largely determine. And the second step is what is providing, I would say, the efficiency in the short term through an efficient dispatch and management in the system. So the good news is that we have already 1/2 of that market design. We have the competition in the market. The bad news is that we have a set of patchy and non-coordinated mechanisms for the other half, the competition for the market. And we need to coordinate that and make it a new model. So with that, I'll just conclude by sharing a final thought as a practitioner. I want to come back to the point that, as I think been already stressed very well by David and by Laszlo, it's all about an efficient allocation of risk. And it's all about, I would say, incentives on the parties who are assuming these risks. So Laszlo mentions the construction risk as being the key issue. Whatever the model for nuclear new builds, whether it is long-term contracts or whether it is infrastructure regulation, the specific design of that contract or of the incentive mechanisms and penalties under the RAB regulation will be key to minimize costs for customers, because that will be the way to provide, I would say, efficient incentives to minimize the cost of construction, which is the essential pillar, of controlling costs for nuclear, as we all know. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabien. Also, thank you for almost keeping to the time. Very clearly, that sort of logic, long-term contract, the incentives, the design of that contract, the incentives that come from it, and that then lead over to the efficiency of the construction project. That is sort of one stream of thinking we need to develop also in these 2 days. Welcome to the question and answer session of the session 1. And given the time, I will not make a long introduction, but hand over immediately to Michelle. Michelle, were there any good questions for our panelists?
No, certainly. We had a number of questions, and in fact, our panelists have also taken on answering some of them directly. So I'm sure people have seen the answers. So that means we're only left with the most complicated questions, maybe. I guess maybe I will start with the more general question that David has already answered, which is that as nuclear power is a state-relevant decision, why exploring hybrid models instead, such as for instance, instead of simply looking at public debt? I suppose the person who has the question has in mind the global macroeconomic context as well. So that's the question for several panelists can answer. I don't know who feels the most equipped to answer this question.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Exactly.
Because I did not get it.
Nuclear is a state-relevant decision. Why explore hybrid models for financing instead of simply using public debt?
I can answer that the British government is paranoid about being involved in complex decisions like this, and it would rather indirectly encourage those companies with expertise to do it, and it might, and has not yet decided, to provide some form of assurance. What it has learned is that the way it provided assurance for Hinkley Point was unbelievably expensive, and they're now thinking carefully about how to reduce the cost, but they haven't made a clear statement yet.
I can maybe add one thing to that, which is perhaps another question. We have a lot of essential facilities or public infrastructure which are not necessarily financed by public money. And if we look at examples of PPPs, public-private partnerships, we have again a range of examples, and the initial rationale for that was both that there may be a shortage of public money available in some circumstances, or there may be choices from governments as to how to spend that money. And the other one was connecting to David's point that by involving private parties into this financing, you also give them very powerful incentives to control the cost and to do it efficiently. So this is the whole idea of these public-private partnerships and hybrid approaches. Michel.
I think one very good example to the relevance of this question is the United Arab Emirates, where when the UAE decided that they want to build new nuclear, there was no domestic technical and project management expertise in the UAE. And it turned out that the UAE government very wisely decided to have open international competition for procuring that technological and project management expertise, and decided to work with the Koreans very smoothly and very successfully. But the financing of the project was 100% done from the UAE government. So in practice, given that the UAE is a large sovereign investor, they have sovereign investment funds accumulated from revenues, which are invested in 1% yielding government bonds. In practice, the cost of capital for the UAE government is 1%, the cost of not having more treasuries. And that made the Barakah nuclear projects to be extremely cost efficient, while at the same time, they brought in the best-in-class technical expertise as part of a competitive contract.
François, construction of a nuclear power plant should be done by government directly, by a private company, or by a large company with substantive government involvement?
Well, the question was more about financing, because of course, regarding who is doing the works, as it has been mentioned by Laszlo, it requires a lot of skills. And one of the challenges is to have this long-term view, the standardization and the series effect that consent to maintain those capacities at the highest level. So maybe I would, regarding Laszlo's comment, what is the difference between China, Russia, and Europe and the OECD in general, I would say that yes, that's true, but it highlights the importance of a continuity. We are partnering with the Chinese in Taishan, and Taishan did not have these long delays that we experience in France exactly for those reasons. First, because we had return of experience of Flamanville. So what happened in Flamanville did not happen in Taishan. So that's a proof that the return of experience is actually a very important lever. The second, that the industrial fabric in China, they had continued to build infrastructures, bridges, and complex projects, whereas in many countries, European countries, and in the US, this was not the case. So there is, as I'm used to say, there is learning curves also in the nuclear field. So that's why it is important, and I think that the Polish minister insisted on that. The fact that you need to think about series, and in order and that's also the case in the EAU. So regarding financing, yes, maybe we see that in some countries we have direct, public financing. But I think what we are trying to find, and Mr. Newberry's RAB system is the idea of how to have some kind of correct mix, and like it has been also mentioned in other interventions, in order to have lower capital cost, which is key, in order also to minimize the cost of the energy transition, which is essential to have a success. And at the same time, give the proper incentive to the operator and to the builder to make the right efforts. So this is something that I think the proposal of David Newberry and the Hub is going exactly in that direction in order to involve the state where it can bring value in diminishing the overall cost of capital, and while on the other hand, giving the incentives to avoid, as we say, as we economists say, moral hazard, to give the proper incentive for who builds and will operate the generating plant, the right incentive to maintain costs in check.
Thank you very much. Michel, perhaps one more question?
Yeah, which is somewhat of a follow-up question, which is a point which was in part addressed in David's presentation, which is that today we are going to enter hopefully soon a post-COVID-19 world with a number of recovery packages being developed by countries, and the countries are looking at where to invest money to support long-term growth, and to which extent this may be changing things in terms of the overall economic context where we approach the financing of new nuclear power plants. So David, do you want to elaborate a bit on this? And maybe Laszlo, I think, would be well placed to answer this question as well.
Yes, I think the post-COVID one is a bit misleading because the very short run is going to be shovel-ready projects which will start producing immediate employment prospects. And if we think of the UK, Sizewell C is scheduled optimistically for 2025. So yes, it's good to have it in the pipeline. It's always good if you've made a commitment to net zero in 2050 to think ahead and work out when you're going to start shoveling. But immediately in 2021, I don't think it will be nuclear. It's more likely to be more offshore wind.
Laszlo, the IEA has been writing extensively about this topic over the last few months.
Yes, basically where we see very important tasks in the post-COVID recovery efforts, green stimulus programs and nuclear is basically the application of this old wisdom that if you are at the bottom of the pit, stop digging. That both in Europe and also especially in North America, there's a significant risk of losing nuclear capacity, which could be extended, which still has a good 1 or 2 decades to go without jeopardizing any safety conditions. And very often, this is due to the underlying economics. So extending the lifetime of an existing nuclear unit is extremely cost efficient, but in most countries, there is practically no policy incentive for it. So even very cost efficient lifetime extension opportunities might end up forgotten. Now, so in a longer term, in generalizing, we have to face the fact that Europe has maybe 10 million people working in the service sector, in restaurants, tour guides, museums, and so on. That part of the economy was really badly hit by this coronavirus epidemic and the social distancing restrictions. The idea that all Spanish restaurant waiters and all Italian tour guides will become renewable energy specialists, I think that's slightly out of touch. So we will need to have a broad-based recovery of the European economy in the service sector. The green investment will have useful employment opportunities. In general, especially in countries, I should highlight France, which has by far the largest nuclear industry in Europe. If you take all the nuclear value chain in France, from design, construction, maintenance, everything, and you replace that all with a made in China imported solar panel, I think it would take a really optimistic French economist to believe that that will be that job creation. So this is an important aspect. But as David mentioned, I mean, nuclear is a type of technology which requires not simply year after year, but decade after decade consistent government commitment.
Thank you very much, Laszlo, also for recalling the importance of long-term operations of nuclear power plants in a shorter term post-COVID context. There are really a number of very interesting questions that we could continue discussing, but time is moving on and we need to conclude this first session. Let me end it by thanking once more the speakers with very good presentations that set us on a good path for the next 2 days. I usually like to ask everybody to sort of open their micro so that we can give a bit of an applause, even in a virtual context, but I don't know whether that's going to work with 228. But thank you very much. And that
thank you.
To hand over to Michelle, who will actually moderate session 2. So the way we do it is we have to stop our videos and the speakers of session 2 will need to put on theirs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, and it's my pleasure to moderate this next session. As you understood, we essentially wanted to go from the systemic risk, which was what we addressed in the first session, to the more idiosyncratic issues related to nuclear power, and to then indeed have a deep dive into what are the key risks faced by nuclear new build today, and what are the key principles in terms of allocating this risk. So for this session, it's my pleasure to introduce, we will start this session with Jan Parsons, who is a senior lecturer at the MIT School of Management at in the US. We'll then move on to Mike Middleton, who has worked a lot with the NEA over the last 2 years as the chair of one of our expert groups that was looking at opportunity for cost reduction for nuclear new build, and they will provide a summary of this study, in particular with issues that are relevant to today's discussion. We will then hear from Fiona Reddy, who is a managing director at Fire Energy and has been working extensively in the field of financing nuclear power. And in particular, we will hear from her about the issue of ESG and green taxonomies, which was quickly touched upon in the first session. And then we will conclude with Steve Vaughan, who is co-head of power at Rothschild & Co. In London, and is advising a number of potential nuclear new build projects. With that, I think we can move straight to John Parsons' presentation. So we have only 4 speakers here. So John, you can extend your presentation to 15 minutes. So that we can keep some time for discussion after. And John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Let me see if I can get the share screen going here. Great. So that was an excellent first session, and I hope I can provide some comments that will build off of what was done in the first session. I emphasized in the title for my talk about the madness versus the wisdom of crowds. We have, over the decades, had many different discussions about how to finance nuclear, and they have moved in where the fashion has been to go in one direction, and now the fashion is to go in another direction. And I'm hoping that we can move forward with a little bit of teasing out what works and what doesn't work, as opposed to just jumping from one model to the other. Let me just start off with some preliminaries. We all know that we have to find a way to grow the economy globally. We're going to need to provide a lot more energy, but at the same time, zero out carbon emissions. That's going to be really hard to do. Nuclear is an ideal technology option for doing that, you would think, but the prospects for nuclear are mixed. In the US and Western Europe, as Laszlo in the last session emphasized, we've had enormous construction delays and huge cost overruns, and that has made the prospects for nuclear not what you might think when we're facing a zero carbon challenge. Of course, it's true in the West that we, and several of the nations in East Asia, that there are a lot of questions about safety and waste that need to be addressed too. And I think those play together on the financing issues in important ways that I'll be bringing up in a moment. So what is the role of finance? We're talking, a lot of was made in the openings and in the next session that finance is going to play a role in whether or not nuclear can grow. And I want to understand exactly what that is. I want to emphasize that it cannot be a substitute for reducing construction costs. You have to find a way to solve that project management problem that we've been facing, certainly in the US and in several countries in Western Europe. And unless you solve that problem, it doesn't matter what financing models you come up with. Sooner or later, people are going to reject the technology. So what we are doing, though, is trying to ask, assuming we go ahead and solve those construction cost problems, do some financing models add to the cost while others reduce the cost, and why and how? And that's what I want to get to. So we have a conventional wisdom in the US that's similar to things that have been said in this workshop, that nuclear new build is simply not possible in the regions of the United States that rely on competitive wholesale markets. Of course, we have other regions of the US which use traditional rate of return regulated utilities, and they can build nuclear, so people say. And why is that? What's the difference between these two? I think that conventional wisdom is a little bit too smug. And if you look at historical experience, back in the 2000s, when we already had significantly liberalized wholesale power markets, we had an enormous amount of investment in merchant nuclear plants doing life extensions and capacity upgrades. Obviously not as much money as a new build, but for example, we added more than 7 gigawatts of capacity in upgrades. That's an enormous investment. What made it possible in merchant markets? And in fact, there is good research that demonstrated that there was more likelihood of investment being made in merchant markets than in regulated markets. In the early 2000s, when there was a dream of a nuclear renaissance, there were a number of prospective new builds planned for merchant markets. So I think we have to really think about what has changed about merchant markets. Is it really an inherent property of merchant markets that makes it hard to finance nuclear? What has changed? The United Kingdom has been the location where we've seen experimentation with finance models. That's been great. So there was the electricity market reform and the development of this contract for differences for Hinkley Point C. I think people misunderstand what was going on there. It was advertised as a hedge of wholesale price risk, and that reduced financing costs. But I don't think that was really the key, as I'll indicate in a minute. Now we're talking about the regulated asset-based model for Sizewell C. The rationale there is that now it's shifted from the rationale behind Hinkley Point C, and now the idea is that the government's cost of capital is lower, that the government can afford to finance these things. Private investors are not willing to finance these things. And I want to pitch the points a little differently. So I think there's misdirection and misunderstanding about what's going on in these different financing models. I do not believe the key to lower cost finance lies in any creative financial tools. In particular, contracts for differences made no sense whatsoever in reducing the cost of capital for Hinkley C. You can shift risk with contracts for differences, but you do not reduce risks. I think the real key of what's going on in all of these financing issues is a topic that isn't really discussed often enough, and that's commitment. You need the public authorities to make a commitment behind a multi-billion-dollar investment in a fixed asset. And you can see in the recent history what happens when you don't have that political commitment. We have nation states that are outright banning nuclear plants and closing existing plants. It's not just Germany, Taiwan, Korea, both face that kind of thing. So any company thinking about investing multi-billions of dollars has to have in its mind, is that commitment to nuclear going to be there through the life of this plant when I'm going to earn back the return on my investment? It's not just outright bans. We have taxes that are targeted, for example, taxes on nuclear fuel that have nothing to do with nuclear fuel. It's just a way of extracting profits from the nuclear industry, a convenient tool for doing that. And these are done ex post, and there's no way to evade them. We have out-of-market payments, which is the problem in the European market model and in the US market model, which these out-of-market payments for wind and solar, perfectly good for putting wind and solar into the system, perfectly good for reducing carbon, but they fundamentally rob existing nuclear power plants of profit. And any company who's going to invest multi-billions of dollars looking forward has to ask, is that merchant market going to be influenced by these kinds of out-of-market payments which undermine the profitability of the nuclear? And I think if you look at the actual fine print of the agreement with Hinkley C, it has nothing to do with hedging market price risk. It has to do with these kinds of commitments by political actors. There are clause after clause after clause in the Hinkley C financing contract, which specifically say, if you adjust the taxes on things like nuclear fuel, then the price at which you will buy the power is going to be adjusted to put back the return to the equity investor. If you do something on the waste management that raises the cost for the waste management, then you have to readjust the price so that you are going to leave the equity owner back with the expected profitability that they did originally. Those are the clauses of the contract that made Hinkley C financeable. None of this contracts for difference and volatile wholesale market price. That was all just misdirection and an irrelevant issue. Going forward, the fact that we have so many countries, certainly in parts of the world, in the US and in Europe, that are making these net zero commitments, that's going to increase the need for the public authority to make a commitment behind any investment in nuclear. The generation profile is changing rapidly, policies are changing rapidly, the future industry and market structure is completely uncertain because policies are uncertain, but also technologies are uncertain. So we don't know how CCS is going to develop. We don't know about hydrogen development. We don't know about we don't know about generation 4 nuclear. So the sinking multi-billions of dollars now in something that's supposed to have a 40+ year life, when you don't know how the political environment is going to govern that electricity market, is going to be a real problem. And so that's a good reason for things like a regulated asset base or a commitment to buy the power at a fixed price or what have you. And I think that's the thing we have to look at. So let me just close by saying this distinction between madness versus wisdom. on the one hand, we have people who are advertising financial models as if creative finance is going to lower financial costs, as if shifting risk is going to reduce the financing costs. We'll talk about some details where shifting risk can reduce it. But I just think it's just not true that the government's cost of capital is necessarily less than private investors. As soon as you spend multi-billions of dollars on a project that never happens, as we did in the United States in South Carolina, then your public is going to become less confident about the next investment. So you have to solve the construction problems, and you have to have a public commitment. So that's where I get to the wisdom part. We need low carbon investments. We need nuclear if we can do it rationally with construction schedules that we keep to. But any private investor is going to demand that there be a government authority making a commitment to that project. You can use a RAB model, you can use old style regulation, you can use a fixed price contract as Hinkley C did. All of them amount to the same thing as long as you get to that issue of public commitment. But I will say, if you have problems in construction planning and price risk, you're going to have to ask why the private investor shouldn't bear that risk. Taking that away from the private investor and giving it to the public really requires a better explanation than anybody has given to date. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think that was a very good introduction to this session. I will certainly take from your talk the importance of having a government commitment to nuclear. And in fact, this very much echoes some of the key messages that we've been conveying in our report on reduction of nuclear cost at NEA. It was published last year. And this makes the transition to Mike Middleton's presentation. So Mike, as I said, has been the co-chair of the NEA expert group on the reduction of nuclear construction cost. He's been working extensively in this field in the UK context, most recently with the Energy Technology Institute. And we will provide us a summary of some of the key findings. And I think bring also to some specific points, somewhat different perspective to John, which I think will be good for the discussion that will follow. So Mike, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you for the introduction, Michelle. I'll just share my screen with the presentation. So I wish to take less than 15 minutes to share a little about the project report that was released in June last year. And the title of this was Unlocking Reductions in Construction Costs of Nuclear, a Practical Guide for Stakeholders. Now, I shall explain a little bit more about the scope of this project in a moment, but it was commissioned in a context where for the first-of-a-kind reactors that were being constructed over the last 10 years, we were seeing that the initial cost estimates for those projects, which were characterized by a low level of design maturity and the specific political context of those projects at the time, those cost estimates are different from the cost estimates that we're starting to see for projects being discussed now. And those current projects reflect increased design maturity and lessons learnt following those initial first-of-a-kind projects. And the gap between those two sets of projections has impacted the overall perceived risk to making such investments, and also has potential to impact public acceptance and political commitment. So a little about the scope and purpose of the Red Cost report. It was delivered between 2017 and 2020 by an international expert group under the auspices of the NEA Nuclear Development Committee. Its primary focus was on short-term investment cost reduction opportunities. So investment cost, that's overnight cost, construction plus financing. And in short term, we meant projects that could be operating plants or in construction by around 2030. Now that largely meant we were focusing on large Generation 3 light water reactors in NEA member countries, but we did touch on other cost reduction opportunities, taking into account small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors. Our process was using the experts in the group and their experience of projects that they'd worked on, as well as those in the public domain, to systematically review lessons learnt and experience gained in order to systematically identify opportunities for cost and risk reduction. But because the cost of capital remains such a large part of the plant, the final section of this report does touch on the role of government, in particular addressing financing. So if I was to attempt to tell the story of this project report in one page, it would look a little like this, in that the light blue bars from left to right represent a first of a kind reactor cost, overnight construction cost, a post first of a kind reactor, and then towards the right, long-term cost in a next of a kind in a steady series. And what the chart shows, and is supported by the evidence and case studies in the report, is that from lessons learnt from first of a kind plants, there are opportunities for cost reduction quite early on in terms of delivering lower costs with post first of a kind reactors. And with a continuing commitment and a continuing program, there are further opportunities to reduce costs based on some of the experience of the countries which have had an uninterrupted build sequence. There are some error bars on the chart, and really that's a nod to small modular reactors and advanced reactors, which are in a slightly different time frame, but recognize they're attacking the same things and the same issues, but sometimes in different ways to reduce cost. We've seen this chart earlier from David Newbury, and what we see from the chart on the right is that the cost of capital has a major impact on the levelized cost of power from the plant, and we can see that a doubling of that interest rate can double that cost of capital. But the cost of capital reflects risk allocation and mitigation decisions. Now, some of the cost reduction opportunities that are described in this project report, as well as reducing cost, they're also reducing risk. And so some of these opportunities are both cost reduction measures and risk reduction measures. Now, the project team recognized there was a strong rationale for either direct or indirect government involvement to lower the cost of capital and therefore lower the cost to consumers. And of course, this implies some transfer of risk. This table from the project report on the left identifies some aspects of the project in terms of technology, organization, and policy framework. And the columns on the right recognize stakeholders involved in the delivery of the project. The red crosses in this chart are intended to indicate the risk owner, the organization that's probably best placed to own, manage, and mitigate that risk. But in many aspects, there's not just one organization that can contribute to that risk mitigation, and those are the black crosses. And so the learning from this chart and this work showed that effective risk allocation and mitigation requires concerted efforts amongst industry, government, and support from society. The report also was very clear on the role of government. Now, this is partly the need for long-term planning, because nuclear plants require commitment and specific regulation. Those are long-term activities. But there was also a clear rationale for government intervention on financing, recognising some of the social and environmental challenges that we face and the political mandate to make progress. Also challenges in electricity market and market failures in the ability to bring forward new investment, particularly in high capital infrastructure, but also a macroeconomic context which also supports investment in infrastructure which creates jobs and recovery. So governments can support financing through a range of mechanisms, but what we found on the project is that there isn't a single solution for all circumstances. We find different opportunities on different projects and different routes being pursued in different jurisdictions. And this is shown on the table on the left, that there can be a mixture of different methods of providing support. But the key element about the diagram on the right is that there is a virtuous circle here where risk reduction and cost reduction deliver better performing projects. Those better performing projects in turn offer a lower cost in capital and a lower perception of risk, which in turn attracts a most efficient project next time round. So there is a virtuous circle, and the challenge is in breaking in and delivering those first few projects. And this is where there is that role for government. But it's not necessarily true that it's a constant requirement for financial support. It could be a transitional measure as part of a long-term programme. So to summarise from the Red Cost projects in this context, we recognise that nuclear new build was at a critical juncture. And as in many countries, projects were transitioning from first-of-a-kind reactors. There need to be projects which address the issue of containing cost, containing programme and containing risk in order to counter perception. There was very clear evidence from this report that nuclear projects do not need to be risky or expensive. There are clear track records of successful projects from which lessons that can be learnt. And by applying those lessons systematically, both the cost and the risk of projects can be contained and put on a transition and a curve to repeatable, low cost, low risk projects. But we've seen that affordable financing is key to the economic successful performance of nuclear power plant projects, and governments do have a central role to play in this. The view was that public financial support is needed in the short term, and that there's a range of mechanisms that can be envisaged. But regardless of the choice of support mechanism, it's key that aligning the stakeholders' interest will be a key condition for any successful project. And so that concludes my presentation. And at the very bottom of this slide, there's a link to the full Red Cost technical report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this excellent summary of the report. I think it's important to stress that, like John, you underline the importance of government commitment. Before going into the specific of financing, this is where it starts to put a new nuclear project on a good track. I can also need to indeed underline the very important findings from the Red Cost report in terms of really understanding what happened with first-of-a-kind project, which is essential to really address the perception of nuclear construction risk today. And I will reiterate your point that nuclear power plants don't have to be costly and risky if we go about them in the right way. And these are some of the key issues that we discuss in great length in the report. And then I will also underline the point that indeed important to focus about risk allocation, which means that risk disappear. But it's also equally important when you do that to think about how the way you're going about allocating this risk is supporting the alignment of different parties' interests, which links back to the initial point about government commitment to some extent. So there will be more to discuss later in the Q&A, but I would now like to move to Fiona Rayleigh. Fiona, you don't need introduction. You've been participating in many of our events in the past with NEA and IFNEC. And I think you'll be trying to answer a simple question, which is nuclear is how can it be an investable asset class? So Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me try and share my screen. If this is going to work. No. Oh.
Perfect.
That working? That's working. So yes, the question of whether nuclear is an investable asset class is one that has been raised by the finance community with me and something that needs to be addressed. I think this picture from The Economist is very important. It shows the fight we've had with COVID and that climate change is going to be a much bigger and a much more complicated fight. And the key to answering climate change is to make sure that we can develop as many low carbon technologies as we possibly can. And that will include nuclear and must include nuclear if we have any chance of dealing with this. Sorry, oh, I'm struggling clearly. Before we move into financing of nuclear projects, I wanted to be clear what we're talking about, because in many discussions with many governments, there seems to be a huge confusion about technology development and capital project development. Capital project development being what we're talking about when we're talking about building new nuclear plant, how we get new nuclear plant into production. And I think, to be clear, again, the only way we're going to get new nuclear plant in production is to be clear what the product is. And there are different products depending on the size of the reactor and what answers we're seeking to achieve. And unless you're clear what is the problem you're trying to answer, you're not going to get the finance community to engage anyway. So I think before we start looking at investable asset classes, financing mechanism, funding mechanisms, we have to be clear what we're talking about. So for most of this presentation, we'll be talking about capital projects and the financing of capital projects. But quickly on technology development, I think it's fascinating in the last few years, just the amount of money we've seen go into new nuclear development by the private sector. And that's because nuclear has been seen as the answer to climate change, and it is seen as the future by many high net worth individuals. Fusion in particular has had over 1.5 billion of private financing put into that sector in the last couple of years. And it's done that because it's been seen as an answer, it's been seen as a solution, and it's been seen as something that governments and the private sector need to get involved in. But going back to capital projects, what are they? They're long-term projects to develop or build capital assets, and they're hugely complicated. They involve a lot of money, they last a long period of time, and they're extremely complex. Now, I'd like to take issue with something we've been talking about through much of today. There is a difference between financing methodologies and funding methodologies. Financing methodologies are how you get money into projects. Funding methodologies are how we pay for the projects once we've managed to get some financing into them. Clearly, they are interrelated. Now, for many people, and I've looked at the list Michelle sent me of those involved in this call, we've been talking about financing methodologies for the last 15 to 20 years, because we've been trying desperately to get projects, nuclear projects, project financed. And in talking about project finance, we're talking about no recourse or limited recourse finance, i.e. you set up an SPV, special purpose vehicle, and there is little or no recourse to the shareholders should you get cost overruns, etc. It's never happened in nuclear, and I can't see it happening in the short term. We are still talking about financing methodologies where governments put money into projects, or infrastructure funds, banks, etc., put money into projects through certain specifically designed mechanisms. I've got on the picture there vendor financing. This is something that came out of the UAE project, where we saw an interest in the technology vendor actually putting money into the capital project itself. In the last few years, there's been a significant move away from vendor financing because of the problems. Simply, the vendors cannot take the risks associated with being an investor in a capital project. It's not what their companies are set up to do. It's not what they're intended to do. And as we saw with Westinghouse, it caused a number of issues. Technology companies are there to deliver technology. Rarely can they successfully deliver financing. The other part of this that is key, and it's a point John made, is government's role. Government's role remains paramount in any capital project, whether it's nuclear, renewables, transport, etc., etc. Government's role is absolutely fundamental. It needs to be the policymaker. It needs to establish a long-term policy. I talk about trust and confidence. It needs to provide the trust and confidence to the market to build these projects. I suggest that is the same as John's commitment. It is providing that long-term commitment to the market to say, yes, we want nuclear. Yes, we need nuclear to be part of our development. And yes, we need nuclear to play a role in climate change mitigation. Government also needs to be insurer of last resort. And I'll come on to that further, because that looks at who takes ultimate risk. And with any nuclear project, we know governments take ultimate risks, whether they would like to admit it or not. You can't walk away from a nuclear project as you can with other projects, because you will have nuclear assets to deal with. And fundamentally, government needs to stand at the back of these developments. Some of the other risks that we need to help to mitigate the costs overruns and the delays we've seen in a lot of nuclear projects in the last few years is to set designs early and to make sure we're not over-engineering. We know engineers are brilliant and love to make things better, improve. But when it comes to a capital project, we need to know what's being built and how it's going to be built. So improving the design of a plant from one plant to the other does not help in getting these plants delivered to time and to budget. Big issues need to be resolved with regulators early. We can't leave those to the final development phases where we're looking to put in place site licenses. So we need early engagement with regulators and ideally collaboration between international regulators to move projects forward on a better basis and a better cost basis. And we need to not over-engineer operating models and processes and how licensee companies manage things. We know nuclear is safe. It's one of the safest industries in the world. And I think we get too hung up on what nuclear safety is and how we manage it. We know we manage it brilliantly. And I think we should own that. And we should be clear that we manage it brilliantly. Going back to the government point of providing trust and confidence, or John's word, commitment, governments needs to be strategic, not reactive. There's no sustainable development if all we're simply doing is reacting to a short-term problem. We need that long-term strategic policy. Unless risk can be dealt with, we get an increased cost of capital, as has been spoken about a number of times this morning. One of the reasons the UK government has moved from the CFD model to looking to something akin to a regulated asset-based model, and I say something akin to because we're not talking about a regulated asset-based model as they have in the US. We're not even talking now about a regulated asset-based model as seen on Thames Tideway. We're talking about a regulated asset-based model specifically designed for Sizewell and Wilver and other projects in the UK. There's a debate about whether they'll apply to the smaller projects or not. But we know for the larger projects, we need something akin to a regulated asset-based model, which allows payment of debt, or at least the interest on debt during the construction and preferentially some of the development period. The interest and the interesting thing about Thames Tideway that has to be looked at for nuclear projects is what the government support package is. Where does government step in? Where does government take the ultimate risk? We are seeing more and more project companies, the supply chain, the EPC contractors saying, I'll put my profit at risk, but I'm not putting my costs at risk. Because if I put my costs at risk, I'm going to go out of business if this goes too far wrong. Now, we need to make sure that EPC contractors or contractors in the supply chain manage risk properly and are still on the hook for some risk. But we also need to recognise that government's role in that, in taking the ultimate risk and standing behind these projects. And that's where the UK's RAB starts to look at things slightly different. Now, the challenge comes is once we sorted out all these lovely issues, where do we get some money from? Because governments are not going to pay for all these projects. We want the private sector to be involved. We want the pension funds to be involved. We want the infrastructure funds to be involved. And having discussed this with a number of the pension funds looking at investing in the UK, they've said, it doesn't matter whether we get a RAB or not. The question is, what do we do with ESG, environment, social and governance? So for those of you who don't know, environment, social and governance criteria have come to the fore in the last 10 years in relation to any investment in any project. And that includes companies as well as capital projects. They're investment financial accounting criteria. But the challenge is there are lots and lots and lots of different sets of metrics, and there are lots and lots of different infrastructure funds, banks and pension funds who then have their own sets of metrics. They also link to the taxonomies, but the taxonomies, and Cecilia mentioned earlier a number of taxonomies, it's probably also worth mentioning the UK, Canada, the US, Australia, and a number of other countries are also developing their own taxonomies. But the taxonomies have a little bit to date been used as geopolitical tools and allowed for a certain amount of greenwashing. The green bond principles have also allowed for a certain amount of greenwashing, although they are standard metrics. And because of this greenwashing, nuclear is often not included as an investable asset class. We need to stop the greenwashing. To give you an example of greenwashing, the renewables are often accepted as sustainable green investments. But when it comes to the ESG criteria and reporting criteria, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, there are 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3. But renewables only account for scope 1 and 2, where nuclear to date has had to account for all 3. If you account for all 3, you look at the true life cycle emissions, including waste, including mining, including every aspect of your supply chain. So we need to create a level playing field where nuclear can play equally with renewables and other low carbon projects to make sure that we are assessing projects in the same way. And these are the ways that the banks and the financial institutions look at these projects. The World Economic Forum has created a consultation and produced some guidelines on common metrics, but these have yet to be agreed. And they fall into 4 criteria for ESG: governance, planet, people, and prosperity. And it's a huge number of metrics. Now, it'll be on each institution to consider which of these metrics are most important to them. Let me be clear, the pension funds have said, unless we can make sure nuclear can answer these metrics, unless we can make sure that we have that level playing field, we can't invest in any project. whether we've got a RAB, a CFD or anything else. So we are through the Gen4 Forum, Michelle is helping with this very much. So we are looking at creating that level playing field, or at least suggesting a level playing field, to make sure that nuclear is assessed in the same way as other low carbon projects. So in conclusion, we need the trust and confidence in the market for any investors to come into these projects, and that trust and confidence is largely created by governments and through policy. We need to create that level playing field for low carbon tech through the taxonomies, the green bond principles and ESG. And taxonomies need to be stopped to be used as geopolitical tools and be used for the reason they should be created, which is to assess low carbon projects. And only once we've got those two rather large systems in place will there be support for nuclear to access green, sustainable, whatever you'd like to call it, financing, and to make nuclear an investable asset class. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for this presentation and indeed for reminding us of some basic differences between financing and funding, and the fact that some of the framework we use to think about these issues have been to a large extent linked to the fact that we were for quite some time thinking about project finance for nuclear, and I think we have to come to terms with the fact that probably in the near term at least there won't be nuclear power plants financed with such methods. And indeed, thank you for the second part of your presentation, if I may say, where you provided a very good summary of these important and timely issues related to the development of green taxonomies and ESG criteria more generally, and indeed not to be fault the fact that there's a lot of geopolitics involved in that, and so that's why it's important to get inputs that are fact-based, and I may add that this is precisely part of the mission of the NEA together with our colleagues at the OECD. So we have a project at the moment as part of the Generation for International Forum, for which the IEA is a technical secretariat, and we've been more generally supporting the development of green taxonomies, including in the EU, and I will refer typically to a report we published earlier, last year now, relating to the feasibility of deep geological repository, which is one of the key questions that was raised as part of the EU debate. So I think with that, I will move on to our last speaker, who will, I think, provide a somewhat different take on the UK context compared to John's presentation. So it's my pleasure to give the floor now to Steve Vaughan, who is going to provide some perspective of the story of financing nuclear in the UK context over the last few years. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. And look, I'm conscious of not wanting to repeat a lot of the good things that have been said. I will try and sort of hang some of it onto the sort of practical application with some real names and some real projects. So just to start, as Michelle introduced me, I'm Stephen Vaughan. I'm a managing director in the Power Advisory Group at Rothschild & Co. And our group has got a track record of advising on major nuclear projects, particularly in Europe. But today, as Michelle mentioned, I'm going to focus my remarks primarily on the UK. Now, our involvement over the last two decades has really covered most of the milestone points in the UK. Sale of British Energy to EDF going back a decade and a half. And then more recently, advising the Chinese on their participation in Hinkley Point C. Later with Hitachi, attempting to develop the ABWR project at Wilfer, and currently advising on Sizewell C, which has been mentioned, is raising money for the EPR, which is planned to be built to replicate Hinkley and Sizewell C is due to come on stream in the early 2030s. So I'm going to talk about some of that journey in the UK and why we are currently focused on evolving the new regulatory model, which has been alluded to much, the RAB, why we got here, and what are the ingredients that are going to make it work well for investors and, importantly, for consumers. So if we go back 10 years ago, it was expected to be able to attract interest, private finance interest, and I have to qualify everything here by saying I start with a mindset, a UK mindset, where there's a presumption that private financing and management is the best route to deliver efficient projects. Now that's clearly puts us in one camp, and I appreciate that Laszlo's remarks earlier that we are by no means have got a monopoly. But it was understood, or it was expected, that to attract private sector interest in building nuclear power stations from corporates, we simply needed to offer protection against market price risk and, as John Parsons mentioned, protection against other nuclear specific risks, such as politically motivated closure. And it was from that understanding that the CFD, the Contract for Differences, emerged. And as we know, that establishes a fixed price of power, index linked for a period after the operation starts. But we knew, even with the CFD, that a key ingredient was the need for a large-scale corporate who got the balance sheet scale to lead the project, to fund it, and to absorb the risk on what was likely to be around a £20 billion construction cost for a twin reactor. And we knew that was an undertaking only really feasible for the very, very largest of utilities. And as it transpired, of course, it was only EDF, and even then only with partners, that has been capable of successfully developing a nuclear project under the CFD model, which it did, of course, with Hinkley Point C, which reached its final investment decision back in 2017 and is currently under construction. And that CFD at Hinkley Point, as is well known, and David Newbury alluded to it, has a strike price of £92.50, the guaranteed price of power. That £92.50 in the context of the UK market is considered to be rather expensive. Now, for a number of reasons, nuclear under the CFD model hasn't really attracted any further interest. And the backdrop in the UK has changed in several important respects, some of them negative, some of them positive. The negative point, or more difficult, the things that have created more of a challenge, the price point is today much lower. And that's been driven by the intermittent renewable generation, particularly offshore wind in the UK, which is priced at around £40 per megawatt hour. And although we don't have any obvious available firm, non-intermittent low carbon generation technology, there is a sense that firm nuclear must price at around or below £60 per megawatt hour. So it's not feasible to replicate the Hinkley Point price, not politically feasible. The other thing that we've discovered is perhaps unsurprising, that project development is very expensive. And there's a recognition also that it's particularly difficult and expensive for developers without UK nuclear operation and construction capability to create the relevant qualified resource from scratch. And that was really a lesson that was brought into stark highlight with the very large amount of money that Hitachi invested trying to develop a project in the UK. And the third thing is that there really has been a disappearing universe of developer candidates. And I think, as Laszlo may have mentioned earlier on, we don't see today any OECD corporate of adequate scale currently with an interest to develop nuclear with full balance sheet exposure simply under the CFD model's protections. On the more positive side, the backdrop's changed. We've got obviously a much more ambitious carbon reduction target, particularly our net zero 2050. And the other thing which is very important is that the UK nuclear construction capability has been revived by Hinkley Point C, and there's now an opportunity for the UK to replicate the EPR design and get some next of kind benefits. And it's these changed circumstances that have led to the focus on the new revenue model, the RAB model. As people have said, it mirrors arrangements which are familiar to investors. There have been £160 billion worth of infrastructure essentially backed by private sector in the UK over the last 2 decades. And this model allows a sharing of risks between investors and consumers. Now, there are variants of the RAB model which, for all practical purposes, take all the risk away from consumers. And as Fiona may have mentioned, that isn't the case here. The proposal is to share the construction risk between investors and consumers. And the key to the model is to strike a balance between relieving investors of some of the largest risks in order to make the project investable and to provide reliable financial returns, and yet at the same time maintaining incentives on investors to oversee efficient management and efforts to contain the costs and manage them appropriately. Now, the importance of that balance is shown in this table. And on the top, we've got the construction cost in billions of pounds. And down the side, we've got the weighted average cost of capital. And in the matrix, the levelized cost of electricity, but the relevant WACC and cost combination. Now, to calibrate this, we can say that a WACC of 9%, that's to say the bottom row, more or less corresponds to the WACC used by EDF for its investment in Hinkley Point C, where it takes full construction risk. Now, on the top rows, we have a WACC that is relevant for the lowest cost, lowest risk infrastructure investors, such as you'd expect to see in the RAB model. And the interesting thing is that provided investors can be incentivized effectively to help control the construction costs, then the consumer is best served by a model which attracts the low cost capital and thereby positions in the top zone. So if we take an example, in a case where the base case construction cost might be £16 billion, the risk proposition where consumers and investors share risk may deliver a cost of around £45 per megawatt hour towards the top left in the matrix. Now, under such a model, even if the construction costs overrun by about 30%, taking us to the right, the cost of electricity only rises to about £55 per megawatt hour, or even less to the extent that investors share the risk. The point is that imposing risk on investors, tempting as it is to policymakers, pushes the cost of capital towards the bottom of the matrix, and it can be counterproductive. And the effect of choosing policy to push investors to the bottom, so as to provide strong incentives to keep construction cost outcome on the left-hand side, automatically raises electricity prices significantly. So the better outcome is to ensure a risk model that allows a low risk WACC at the top end of the matrix, even if it carries a greater theoretical risk of construction costs driving to the right-hand side because of the lessened incentives. So this is a cheaper zone than this. Put it a different way, being at the top of the matrix through a choice of RAB model is better than being at the bottom, even if it causes a theoretical risk of drifting the costs to the right. Now, obviously, the case for a RAB is much easier in the context of a next of a kind replica, such as we're expecting at Sizewell C, than it might have been for a first of a kind. I'm just going to build on that for our practical application. One of the ways in which the RAB model traditionally drives down the cost of capital is through its capacity to raise significant amounts of cheap debt finance. And in a large-scale nuclear project, this might entail as much as 10 or 15 billion pounds worth of debt. And for this quantum, it's necessary to be attractive to the deepest pools of the debt capital. And this means ensuring that the debt is low enough risk to attract a strong investment grade credit rating. Our target for Sizewell C is to achieve a BBB plus, or better still, an A minus credit rating. And this establishes a very demanding standard of risk protection, strong risk protections from the revenue model. And that revenue model, the defined definition of the RAB, will be vital in getting that strong investment grade credit rating. Now, that credit rating then becomes a pivotal platform to attract the lowest risk and therefore the lowest cost equity investors. So the logic sequence is establish a structure of RAB low enough to attract a good investment grade credit rating, and that's your platform for then going and pursuing the procuring the equity investment. So just to summarize, the key components of the RAB model approach for Sizewell C is the low risk starting point, which is rooted in a next of a kind project. And it's been enabled by EDF proving the UK EPR and taking the full design risk in the earlier Hinkley Point C, and then close replication of that Hinkley Point C supply chain. There's then the layer of further risk reduction for the investors by a significant sharing of all risks by the consumers, and to John Parsons' point, protection by government from the nuclear specific risks, such as politically motivated discontinuation. And this should deliver a low risk investment proposition that's capable of supporting investment grade debt, and therefore, as well as attracting low risk equity investors. We're expecting firm low carbon power then to be deliverable in a price range of 40 to 60 pounds per megawatt hour. And then that delivers all of the other package of wider benefits to expect from a nuclear project. In the case of the UK, we're expecting 70% UK jobs content during construction, and those will be skilled jobs by and large. The waste heat potential for example, higher efficiency, green hydrogen and other heat applications relevant for the energy transition, as well as deepening the UK capability for subsequent nuclear with whatever technology that later implies. So those were really the sort of observations that I wanted to make, and I'll hand back to you, Michel.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for taking us through the journey of the UK nuclear new build experience. We'll be hearing on and off about Hinkley Point and Sizewell, but it's good to have this deep dive into the logic between the two mechanisms, schemes, and indeed I will keep in stress to the point you made, which is you also need to look about the capability on the developer side, and that indeed on the industrial side, and that indeed there is none today that are able anymore to take on nuclear new build projects on the balance sheet. And then last but not least, indeed, the importance of getting investment grade and what that means in terms of opening pools of capital. So with that, I think we are set for the discussion and Q&A session, and we had different perspective, I think overall converging on the issue of financing nuclear. But I will pass it on to Jan to tell us about questions from the Q&A chat.
Yes, thank you, Michel, and thank you to the speakers. We didn't get a whole lot of questions, and one was answered directly by John. However, there was one very interesting question, and I would like to start with that one. And I do have a number of questions myself, actually. But the question that came in was addressed to Fiona. And Fiona, you had a slide in which you talked about over-engineering, or the tendency or the risk of over-engineering. And the question was, could you please provide examples or some of the facts that you have about over-engineering? And I would like to latch on to that question immediately, because I had noted it too as something very interesting and I would really like to know more about it. To which extent does the term over-engineering stand for over-regulation, or let's say for sort of an unhappy relationship, let's say, with the regulator in the widest possible sense? So could you perhaps try to answer these two questions, please?
Sure. I think there are possibly 3 points in there. Okay. So when I refer to over-engineering, the perfect example in the UK, where we historically have a fleet of Magnox stations and a fleet of AGR stations. And every single plant is different. Because engineers found improvements that can be made and changes that can be made from one plant to the other. And it's a point that's been picked up by others. If you want to build a fleet and you want to get the benefits of a fleet, you need to have a design and fix it. And that is something, for example, the NRC is very good at saying, this is a design that's been regulated, this is a design that will be built in this country. And that was one of the things that the UK's generic design assessment process was intended to deal with, was making sure we had a fixed design that was going to be built across a fleet of projects. But we've seen, even with the projects being built today, between Hinkley and Sizewell, yes, there are a lot of commonality, but there were changes that have been made because people think there are benefits to be had by changing the plan. And that is never a good place to be when it comes to trying to bring in private sector financing. Financiers want to know what's going to be built so that they can have a certain belief that things will be built to time and to budget and things will be delivered. When it comes to over-regulation, I think that's very much depends on the regulator. So the ONR in the UK is a permissive regulator. So you have to show, it's on the developer to show how you are complying with the project. And the regulator will not try generally to impose extra requirements on you. Now, clearly, if there's, God forbid, an international incident that creates issues or raises concerns, then they should be dealt with. But generally, if you've got a plant that's been built, it has no issues, that is the plant that should be built and it shouldn't be changed over time. So I think you've got that collaboration and that interrelationship between the investors who want to know what's being built, how it's going to be built. You've got the engineers who can say, but I can always make this better. And you've got the regulators who would prefer you to build what you'd say you've built in the first place. So there's that aspect. And the final aspect comes to the over-engineering of processes and procedures. I think the US is much better than some other countries on this, of saying, let's have a thin organization. Let's not over-engineer what our organization should look like. We don't need 1 million people in there because it's simply a nuclear project. Because the more people you have on a project, the more the costs go up, the more fundamentally you have cost increases with more process. And so I think there's that aspect of over-engineering as well. You clearly need to have key personnel in a business. You need to make sure you can operate your nuclear asset safely and securely. But if you've got a fleet, for example, why can't HR processes cover the fleet rather than the individual plant? And so I think we need to think about some of those things as well, because on some of the new build projects I've been involved in the last 15 years, there's been this great desire to create an all-encompassing operating model that can cover every aspect of anything that could possibly go wrong, rather than create an operating model that is sufficient and well-balanced to be able to operate your asset.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to come in on that point? If not, I have another question for John, actually. John, for the pleasure of argument, you seem to imply that basically reallocating risks cannot reduce risks. And did I overinterpret you, or is that sort of the essence of what you're saying? Because we're sort of developing at NEA more sort of a thinking along the lines, you know, Calabresi, Posner, you should allocate risks to the party that has the best means of reducing them, because in a world with transaction costs, incidence does matter. Could you perhaps just comment? Of course, in this discussion, we can only sort of illuminate a number of aspects, but could you perhaps comment on that point?
Sure. Well, shifting risk to the party that can best manage the risk is obviously an excellent thing to do. It can improve the efficiency of projects. It can improve the likelihood that the project will be done well in a number of ways. So I don't have any problem with that. Okay. That is not what is behind the RAB model. Remember, the RAB model is taking risk away from the party who will be doing the construction and giving it to the population. And the population has no ability to manage that risk, no ability to improve the quality of the construction and so on. The only economic rationale that could exist behind that is one that has never been stated by any of the authors in favor of using the RAB model, which is that, well, it's been stated, but has never been articulated in a formal way, that these big companies whose balance sheets you're worried about are somehow more risk averse to this stuff, and it's expensive in the sense of a principal agent model to give them too much of the risk. Stephen was hinting at that kind of thing. So you're trying to find how much risk do you need to give them to extract the benefit of them running the project well. But frankly, we don't have, there's very, very few formal exercises to know where is that, how much you do. So you're saying to the, and in the United States, we had these projects in Georgia and South Carolina, which have now, in South Carolina, the people of South Carolina who were funding that project have now just been told to eat the loss. But they didn't know how to have any ability to manage the project. So I think we have to think carefully about, why are we removing risk from the project manager? Maybe it's the right thing to do, but we need to be more straightforward about that.
Mm-hmm. Do I understand correctly that there are two aspects to that? One is really sort of the distribution of risks with sort of an equity issue kind of thing. And another is sort of an incentive issue, that if you take away the risk from the party constructing it, construction might take longer, might cost more, or that's not a point?
Yeah, that second one is the point.
That second one is the point. Okay. Thank you very much. Stephen, would you like to come in on that or comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just echoing some of the things that John said, but building on them, it clearly becomes problematic. You have moral hazard when the risk is taken away from the investor completely. And so the discussion on the RAB is going to center on what is the appropriate sharing mechanism. And we can sort of see from parallels, mainly in other industries, where, for example, you have joint venture models where you might have a lead operator or an operating partner. And I think it's pretty common for lead operators to have 50% stakes or less. So we're pretty confident at a 50-50 sharing of risk, still pretty strong incentives on the investor. I think once you start to get below, say, 33%, then the incentive starts to run out, and you also have to be very careful that there isn't value leakage in a way to the investor in different ways. But that sharing is exactly the right thing. It's about striking the balance. And I think, you know, the problem is that for these very large projects, big corporates simply don't want to have the full risk hanging around, which is why, you know, we're driving towards special purpose corporates in the context of the RAB, and in these situations we have to be much more forensic about the way that risk needs to be allocated in order to keep the things financeable. But the second of a kind is a critical part of this. I think in first of a kind, the problem is that your cost uncertainty is so great that it's a risk that consumers are really unhappy about taking for the reasons that John alluded to in South Carolina.
A small follow-up question. You mentioned that Sizewell 3 was aiming for a BBB plus or an AAA minus rating. What are the sort of interest rates that correspond to those qualities of risk? Just roughly for the non.
But terrible person to ask. Yeah, I simply couldn't tell you off the top of my head. The key thing about hitting those credit ratings is to establish a depth of market that's capable of providing the sort of quantum of funds. You know, a debt raise of 10 to 15 billion pounds is a huge debt raise, particularly from a non-corporate. And to do that credibly, you've got to be in the not just investment grade, but good investment grade territory. And that was really the purpose of the two pictures, the two graphics that I showed side by side. That you know, if you were trying to do this at sub-investment grade, you just haven't got the depth of market. You'd be using up years and years of capacity just on the one project. It's not going to happen. So you've got to push right to the top end, and I think that means that in negotiating a RAB, I don't know, setting a RAB, policymakers setting the RAB, they need to know that, you know, the rating agencies will need to be satisfied to get that sort of credit rating. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So
it's a liquidity issue as much as sort of a complete level issue kind of thing.
Yeah, the two things run together, but debt capital is going to be incredibly cheap at the moment, certainly by reference to the numbers that I had on the left-hand side of the table in the early matrix.
I have one more question for Fiona on a completely different issue, which is the ESG issue. And I mean, you gave us an overview, and that was definitely helpful. But where do you see this whole thing going? I mean, does nuclear have the possibility to satisfy ESG criteria for a sizable amount of investors? Of course, you're absolutely aware of what's going on at the level of the European Union. That right now we're sort of in a sort of transition or in a discussion. Could you perhaps comment on that a little bit more, sort of future oriented, where nuclear will end up?
Yeah, sure. I do think nuclear can satisfy the ESG criteria. I think it satisfies it, well, very well. The report Michelle and I are working on for the Gen 4 forum at the moment is already, I think, 120 pages, because the list of criterion is extensive if you start looking at different systems. But the interesting thing is nuclear answers pretty much all of them incredibly well. The reason for saying we need the level playing field is because there were two different aspects. You've got the taxonomies, which are political, and you've got ESG, which is to do with the financing and the financial accounting for the financing organizations. The argument that the finance community is seeking to put forward is Politically, it's up to a country whether they want to build nuclear or not. That is a jurisdictional risk. It should not be precluded because of the taxonomies. And unfortunately, the EU taxonomy is being used to preclude European financing from a lot of nuclear projects. So it needs to be addressed. Thankfully, as I said earlier, the UK, Canada, Australia, France, etc., are all drafting their own taxonomies. So from a political position, we're probably going to end up with a geopolitical fight that is on a global perspective rather than an EU perspective, because there are many countries within Europe who would support nuclear falling within the taxonomy. When you look at the ESG and the criterion that the investment community look at, they simply want to say, can nuclear satisfy these? Now, the two big issues that remain the big issues for nuclear are greenhouse gas emissions, low carbon, and waste. The greenhouse gas emissions, even the European community has accepted nuclear is a low carbon technology and is akin to wind and solar projects in terms of emissions. But in fact, when you look at it from an ESG criterion, because nuclear reports to scope 1, 2, and 3, so looks at the complete life cycle, and renewable projects only report to 1 and 2, nuclear often comes out better when you start looking at the whole of the life cycle. And that plays into the waste point, because yes, nuclear creates waste, but so do renewable projects. And at the moment, nobody's questioning how renewables deal with their waste or how that's managed. Nuclear projects, nuclear new build projects are now established so that we fund waste disposal and waste management in the project costs of the nuclear new build project. Nobody's asking renewable projects to do the same. Now, I don't think we should get into a big fight with renewables about all this, because the truth is to deal with climate change, we've got to deal with, and we've got to build as many low carbon assets as we possibly can to have any chance of getting to net zero by 2050. But what we do need to do is recognise that everybody needs to be playing on the same level playing field. So if you're asking nuclear to deal with its waste and to build in the cost of dealing with its waste into its project costs, which we do, shouldn't we be doing the same for other projects? And so a lot of the work is actually around education and showing different investors, showing different financial institutions. Nuclear in some ways has done this for a long time better than other projects and addressed some of these issues better than other projects. And we need to make sure that that's recognised, so that when a project goes to an investment committee, it's being assessed in the same way and on the same level playing field. That makes sense.
Good. Thank you very much. In the meantime, I've been asking my own questions and I've been missing a number of questions that have come in. I apologize for that. There's one to Stephen, which reads, in case of the state aid investigation of the European Commission for PAX2 in Hungary, the new build project, the Commission decided to set the acceptable WACC range between 7.4% and 8.35%, so 7.4 and 8.4%. You presented much lower WACC values. Could you please comment on that? Why are WACC so much lower in the UK than in Hungary?
Well, the WACC, of course, for Hinkley Point C was 9%. That was one where the market price risk was taken by the consumer, but the full construction risk was left on EDF. In the case of the RAB model, we might be looking at around 5% post-tax nominal WACC, in which both construction risk is shared. Of course, it depends what is the sharing percentage. Will that drive to a lower or higher WACC? It depends. But also the market risk is borne by the consumer. What I don't know is for PAX is where it fits in that risk profile. I think the other thing which is important in PAX is that you have a non-OECD actor providing the EPC contract. And I think a point that was being made by a number of speakers is that the real problem with construction is integrating the different subcontractors In the case of PAX, that'll be delivered, I think, by a main contractor who will substantially take the EPC contract risk. And that again has a material impact on the investor return. So I sort of partly ducking it. I'm saying you're bracketed. There's nothing UK intrinsic about me proposing different WACCs. There's nothing implicit in that. Okay, thank you.
And there's another question which is slightly provocative, but we might read it out nevertheless. How do you comes back to the issue we already discussed. How do you incentivize the project company to deliver within their committed envelope? Is the real issue skills gap in the West to constructing such complex projects? So it's actually two questions. First, what's the best incentive structure? And to some extent, we already commented on that. But is there a skills issue for projects in EU and US for such complex nuclear projects? Who would like to take that on?
Mike.
Yeah, I was thinking about Mike too.
Thank you very much for that, Michelle. So, so speaking to the skills issue in particular, what we learned from the events in the Red Cross study is that for countries or jurisdictions around the world where they set around their first few projects, there was a lot of learning to be gained in the execution of those first few projects. And so there is an accumulation of skill that occurs both within the industrial supply chain in that country, but also the experience in building particularly large and difficult projects. And there is experience from a few countries around the world that have set around committing to build a chain of plants, a program of plants, where you see both the learning as applied from project to project, but also a program of plants creates a capability to grow and sustain a skills base. So this leaves a challenge in countries that are restarting nuclear programs that have not built plants for a while. But it also gives challenges for some countries which have not previously had nuclear power plants and are talking about and thinking about introducing a fleet. And in the Red Cross project, there are approaches that can be that are described that can be used to help reduce some of those risks, so that even if it's a restart program or a new program, it can avoid some of the lessons that have been run on recent projects where costs and budgets and durations weren't contained.
Thank you very much. The others are basically a comment and a rather large descriptive questions. Michelle, with that, I would like to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Anne, and I'd like again to thank our four speakers for the excellent presentation and for the discussion. I think you know, there are some key themes that keeps coming back. You know, one of it is that all of these issues start with commitment from government. The other is that when you think about the risk, you need to really think hard about how these risks are going to be allocated and whether the party that is bearing the risk is the best party. And as some have said, indeed, for some of the first of a kind projects that we've built over the last decade or so, sometimes this wasn't fully thought of, and eventually the risk materialized, and some parties and sometimes customers have to bear this risk. With that, I think we are right on time to finish today, which is excellent, and we'll be equally on time to start tomorrow for our next two sessions and final concluding roundtable. which were essentially be moving from discussing some of these issues at a conceptual level to really discussing them in practice. First, as we mentioned in introduction, looking at lessons learned from nuclear, but also finding similarities and differences from other large infrastructure projects. That will be the third session. And the fourth session will be bringing together a set of key policymakers from NEA member countries that are currently actively discussing schemes for financing nuclear power plants. So the timing for tomorrow's session will be like today, Paris time, 2 p.m. until 5:30. And the last 30 minutes, in fact, will be a concluding roundtable where we'll be joined by our colleagues from Poland and IFNEC, which will be the opportunity for us with the rest of the panelists from today and tomorrow to brainstorm about next steps for us, in particular when it comes to the project that NEA is leading and to what Poland is aiming as well, along with IFNEC. So with that, I can just thank again our excellent speakers today, and I say well, see you tomorrow to everybody.